There's a patch of dry, cracked earth in southern Iraq today where wind pulls dust across mounds that used to be some of the tallest buildings on the planet. Sheep wander through what used to be the busiest streets on earth. Buried under that dust are clay tablets, thousands of them, still holding the handwriting of people who died 5,000 years ago. Shopping lists, complaints about bad beer, and the very first record of a human being figuring out how to make another human read words instead of just hear them. It mattered. Your clock, your calendar, the wheels on your car, the number system you use to check your bank balance, the courtroom your cousin sat in for jury duty, the beer in your fridge, all of it traces back, thread by thread, to a handful of muddy riverbank towns most people couldn't point to on a map. So let's go there. Let's walk through what the Sumerians actually built, the inventions that changed everything and the ones that just made daily life a little less miserable, and find out how one of the strangest, most inventive peoples in history ended up inventing history itself. Writing, the invention that ended prehistory. Before we get into anything else, we have to sit with this one for a while, because it's the invention that makes all the others possible for us to even know about. Every other civilization before Sumer, and there were plenty of clever ones, left us guesswork. Bones, pot shards. The occasional cave painting we have to interpret like a Rorschach test. The Sumerians left us their own words, written in their own hand, telling us in their own voice what they were thinking. That's an almost unbelievable gift, and it happened almost by accident. Around 3,400 to 3,200 BCE, in the city of Uruk, along the banks of the Euphrates, the earliest people we can call Sumerians were running into a very boring, very human problem. Their economy had gotten too big for memory. Temples were storing enormous quantities of grain, wool, and livestock. Merchants were exchanging goods across long distances. Someone had to keep track of who owned what, who owed what, and who had paid what. For thousands of years before this, people had used small clay tokens, little shapes representing a jar of oil, or a sheep, or a measure of grain, to keep informal accounts. You'd seal a handful of these tokens inside a hollow clay ball, called a bulla, as a kind of receipt. But there was an obvious flaw. Once the tokens were sealed inside, you couldn't check the count without breaking the ball open. So somebody, and we will never know their name, had an idea that quietly ended prehistory. Before sealing the tokens inside the clay ball, press the shapes of the tokens onto the outside of the wet clay first. Now you had a record on the surface that matched the tokens hidden within. And once you had a system for pressing symbols into wet clay to represent objects, someone eventually realized you didn't need the tokens at all. You could just press the symbols onto a flat tablet. That flat tablet is in essence the first page in human history. At first, this proto-writing was purely pictographic. A drawing of a sheep's head meant a sheep. A drawing of an ear of barley meant barley. These early scribes used a sharpened reed, cut at an angle, to draw these pictures into soft clay. It was slow, and it was limited to nouns you could actually draw. You couldn't yet write a sentence. You couldn't say, "The temple owns 30 sheep, and 10 of them were given to the shepherd last month." You could only tally sheep-shaped scratches next to temple-shaped scratches. It was accounting, not literature. It was a spreadsheet, not a story. But something remarkable happened over the following few centuries. Roughly between 3000 and 2900 BCE, the scribes of Sumer began simplifying their pictures because drawing curved lines into clay with a reed stylus is clumsy and slow. Curves became a series of straight impressions instead. The stylus, held at an angle, created a wedge shape when pressed into the clay, and pulling it out left a triangular head with a thin tail trailing behind, like a tiny arrowhead. This wedge-shaped writing is what we now call cuneiform, from the Latin word for wedge. Over time, the pictures became so abstracted and stylized that a modern person looking at a sheep symbol from 2400 BCE would never guess it started as a drawing of a sheep's head at all. And here is where things get genuinely fascinating, because the scribes hit a wall. Pictures alone could represent objects, but Sumerian, like every human language, was full of ideas that have no physical shape. How do you draw happiness? How do you draw to give, or tomorrow, or a person's name? The breakthrough came when scribes realized that written symbols could represent not just the thing they depicted, but the sound of the word for that thing. This is called the rebus principle, and you've actually used it yourself if you've ever seen a children's puzzle where a picture of an eye plus a picture of a can equals the phrase "I can." The Sumerians did exactly this, but for an entire language. A symbol that had originally meant read, pronounced roughly like jai, could now be used to represent the sound jai in a completely unrelated word, even if that word had nothing to do with reeds. This single leap, using symbols for sound rather than only for meaning, is what allowed writing to escape the narrow lane of bookkeeping and become capable of recording anything a person could say out loud. Grammar, verb tenses, names, prayers, laws, poems, complaints, jokes. All of it became possible the moment sound entered the system. Scholars consider this the true birth of a complete writing system, as opposed to a simple set of accounting symbols, and it's one of maybe 3 or 4 times in all of human history that writing was invented completely from scratch, without borrowing the idea from someone else. Egyptian hieroglyphs came shortly after, and many historians believe the Egyptians may have gotten the basic idea of writing from contact with Mesopotamia, even though their symbols developed independently and looked completely different. By around 2600 BCE, cuneiform had become a mature, flexible system capable of writing full sentences in the Sumerian language, and it eventually contained hundreds of distinct signs, some representing whole words, some representing syllables, some representing both depending on context. Learning to read and write it was not easy. It took years of dedicated training, and we know this because we still have the training exercises. We have tablets where young students copied out lists of signs over and over, the same repetitive drills you'd expect from a classroom of bored 10-year-olds, except these particular bored 10-year-olds lived 4,000 years ago. We also have something rarer and more human, complaints written by these students. One surviving text, often called by modern translators something like a schoolboy's account of a hard day, describes a student's frustration with his teachers. He's whipped for being late, whipped for talking, whipped for standing up without permission, whipped for his handwriting. It reads almost exactly like something a tired parent might joke about today, except it was carved into a permanent record by a person who has been dead for roughly 4,000 years. There's another well-known tablet, sometimes described as the world's oldest recorded case of a student trying to get on his teacher's good side, where a father is said to have thrown a dinner party and given gifts to his son's schoolmaster, specifically so the teacher would praise the boy in front of his classmates. Bribery for grades is, apparently, not a modern invention either. Cuneiform did not stay confined to Sumerian, because it was such a flexible, adaptable system, capable of representing both meaning and sound. Later peoples who spoke completely different languages simply borrowed it and adapted it to their own tongues. The Akkadians, who spoke a Semitic language completely unrelated to Sumerian, adopted cuneiform and used it for over 2,000 years. The Babylonians and Assyrians, both descended from Akkadian speaking cultures, used it too. Cuneiform eventually spread across the ancient Near East and was used in one form or another for writing Elamite, Hittite, Hurrian, and Eurasian, among other languages. It remained in continuous use for roughly 3,000 years, only fading out in the first few centuries of the modern era, as alphabetic scripts written on more portable materials like papyrus and parchment gradually took over. And this is the part that should genuinely stop you in your tracks. Cuneiform was eventually forgotten completely. Not gradually faded from memory the way old customs slowly disappear, but forgotten entirely, to the point that for well over 1,000 years, nobody on earth could read it. The last people who understood cuneiform died out sometime around the 4th century of the modern era, and after that, the script became nothing more than strange decorative marks carved into ancient ruins. Travellers in the following centuries who stumbled across cuneiform inscriptions in Persia genuinely had no idea what they were looking at. Some speculated the marks were made by birds walking through wet plaster. Others thought they were purely ornamental patterns with no linguistic meaning at all. It wasn't until the 1800s that European scholars, working mostly from a massive trilingual inscription carved into a cliff face in Persia, known as the Behistun inscription, painstakingly cracked the code. The inscription had been carved by order of the Persian king Darius I, and it repeated the same royal proclamation in 3 different cuneiform-based languages side by side. An English officer named Henry Rawlinson risked his life dangling from ropes on a sheer cliff face to copy the inscription, and using it as a kind of Rosetta Stone for cuneiform, scholars slowly reconstructed how to read Old Persian, then Elamite, and eventually the far older and more complex Akkadian and Sumerian scripts. Once that door was opened, an entire lost civilization came flooding back into human memory all at once, after being silent for well over 1,000 years. So what did the Sumerians actually write down once they had the tools to write anything? Nearly everything a society could think to record. There are tens of thousands of surviving administrative documents, receipts, tax records, ration lists, inventories of temple property. There are royal inscriptions bragging about military victories and building projects. There are letters between family members, some of them surprisingly petty and personal, complaining about debts unpaid or insults received. There are legal contracts for the sale of land, houses, and enslaved people, complete with witnesses listed by name. And there is literature, real literature, myths and hymns and proverbs and laments, some of which are staggeringly beautiful even in translation. Among the most famous of these literary works is the story cycle surrounding a ruler named Gilgamesh, a king of the city of Uruk, who may have actually existed as a historical figure sometime around 2700 BCE based on his appearance in later king lists. Over the centuries, stories about Gilgamesh grew and combined until they eventually formed what many scholars consider the oldest great work of literature in human history, later compiled most fully by the Babylonians in a version called the Epic of Gilgamesh. It tells of a powerful but arrogant king who befriends a wild man named Enkidu, loses him to death, and then travels to the edge of the world searching for a way to escape mortality himself, only to be told, essentially, that no human being ever has and no human being ever will. It's a story about grief, friendship, and the terror of realizing you're going to die, written down roughly 4,000 years before anyone had the word existential to describe what the main character was going through. There's also a passage within this larger story cycle describing a catastrophic flood sent by the gods to wipe out humanity, with one man warned in advance and instructed to build a boat to save his family and animals. If that sounds familiar, it should. Scholars have long noted the striking similarities between this Mesopotamian flood account and the story of Noah found much later in the Hebrew Bible, and the general consensus is that flood traditions were widespread and ancient across the region, with the Mesopotamian versions predating the biblical account by well over 1,000 years. We're not here to make theological arguments one way or another. We're simply pointing out that among the very first stories ever written down by human beings One of them was already about a devastating flood and a man who built a boat to survive it. Cuneiform also gave us the oldest known catalogue of a library, essentially a list of texts held in one particular collection, which tells us that already, in this astonishingly early period, people were organising written knowledge into something resembling an archive. And it gave us the oldest known written legal codes, which is a subject substantial enough that we need to spend real time on it a little later in this video, because the stories buried in those laws are some of the most human, and in some cases genuinely brutal, things you'll hear all day. Before we move on from writing itself, it's worth sitting for a second with just how strange it must have felt to be one of the first people alive who could do this. Every person before this moment in history who wanted to send a message across distance had to rely entirely on a messenger's memory, hoping the words survived the journey intact. Every ruler who wanted their name remembered had to rely on oral storytelling being passed down accurately across generations, hoping it didn't get distorted or forgotten. And suddenly, in one river valley, a small number of trained scribes could press a message into wet clay, let it dry into something nearly as hard as stone, and send actual unchanging words across hundreds of miles, or bury them in a foundation and have them survive, unread, for 4,000 years, only to be dug up and understood again by someone from a country and a language that didn't even exist yet. That's the invention we're about to spend the next several hours unpacking the consequences of. And it's not even the only one that changes the way you'd have to imagine daily life in the ancient world. Coming up, we're going to look at how the same people who figured out writing also figured out how to move heavy objects for the first time in a way that didn't require dragging them across the dirt, and the story of that invention is a lot stranger and involves a lot more mud than you'd probably expect. The wheel, born from a potter's workshop, not a battlefield. Here's something that tends to surprise people the first time they hear it, because it goes against almost every cartoon and textbook illustration of cavemen inventing the wheel that we all grew up with. The wheel was not invented to move things. It was invented to make pots. Around 3500 BCE, potters in Mesopotamia were working with a persistent, frustrating problem. Shaping clay by hand, or by coiling long ropes of clay into a bowl shape and smoothing the walls, was slow, and it produced pottery that was rarely symmetrical. Somebody figured out that if you placed a flat, heavy disc on a kind of pivot, you could spin the disc, and while it spun, you could hold your hands steady and let the rotation of the clay itself do the work of shaping a perfectly round vessel. This device, generally regarded as the earliest true wheel humans ever built, is the potter's wheel. It didn't carry anything anywhere. It just spun in place, on a fixed axle, in a workshop. What makes this such a strange leap of imagination is that a wheel has no equivalent anywhere in the natural world. Nearly every early human tool has some kind of natural inspiration behind it. A spear resembles a sharpened stick or a horn. A knife resembles a claw. Nets resemble spider webs. But nothing in nature rolls on a fixed axle, and the wheel and axle concept had to be conjured up out of pure abstraction. It also required metal tools sharp and precise enough to carve a smooth, round hole through the centre of a disc and shape an axle that would fit snugly enough to bear weight without wobbling apart. Without that precision, a wheel is just an oversized coin that spins loosely and falls off its post the moment you load any real weight onto it. It took a genuinely long stretch of time, probably several centuries, for someone to realize that this spinning potter's disc could be tipped onto its edge and used to roll things forward. Before that leap happened, heavy loads in Mesopotamia were moved the way they'd always been moved, dragged across the ground on flat sledges, sometimes with logs laid underneath as rollers, requiring teams of labourers straining against ropes. There's actually a persuasive body of thought suggesting that this exact method, giant stone blocks dragged over rolling logs by teams of workers, was how some of the truly massive multi-ton stones of the ancient world were transported before wheeled vehicles existed at all. It works. It's just brutally labour-intensive. Once the idea of a rolling wheel clicked into place, the earliest wheeled vehicles we have evidence for date to around 3,200 to 3000 BCE, and they were not sleek spoke chariot wheels like you'd picture from a Roman epic. They were heavy, solid discs, sometimes carved from a single piece of wood, and sometimes, more cleverly, built from 3 separate wooden planks cut to shape and fitted together side by side, then held firm with wooden struts running across the seams so the whole assembly rotated as one solid piece around the axle. This 3-plank construction technique appears again and again in the archaeological and artistic record and seems to have been the standard method for a very long time because it lets Sumerian craftsmen build a wide, sturdy wheel without needing to find or carve a single tree trunk wide enough to produce a solid disc that size. The most vivid picture we have of these early wheeled vehicles in action comes from an object that has become one of the most famous pieces of Sumerian art ever discovered, the so-called Standard of Ur. This is a small, hollow, box-shaped object, roughly the size of a briefcase, covered on its 2 largest sides with intricate mosaic-style inlay made of shell, red limestone, and lapis lazuli set into bitumen, a kind of natural asphalt that worked as ancient glue. It was found in one of the royal tombs of Ur, excavated in the 1920s by the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley, and it dates to roughly 2600 to 2500 BCE. Nobody is entirely sure what its original purpose was. It might have been the soundbox of a musical instrument, it might have been ceremonial, but what makes it so valuable to us is simply what it depicts. One side of the Standard of Ur shows scenes of war. 4-wheeled battle wagons roll over the bodies of defeated enemies, pulled by teams of animals that were probably onagers, a wild relative of the donkey, since true domesticated horses hadn't yet arrived in the region in large numbers. Soldiers march behind the wagons in formation, and captured prisoners are led away, stripped and bound, to be presented before a large, seated figure who is almost certainly meant to represent the king. The other side of the standard shows the opposite of war entirely, a peaceful banquet with the same large-seated figure now feasting, attended by servants bringing food and drink, while below him other figures lead cattle, sheep and fish toward the celebration, apparently the spoils and produce being brought in from a successful campaign or a bountiful harvest. It is, in a strange way, one of the oldest surviving illustrated stories in existence, and it happens to be one of our very best pieces of physical evidence for how early Sumerian wheeled transportation actually looked. It also happens to depict something that will keep coming up throughout this entire video, over and over again, in almost every single Sumerian invention we discuss. It was made for one of 2 reasons: controlling or feeding people, war or wealth, and nearly everything the Sumerians built served one of those 2 purposes. These early wheeled wagons on the Standard of Ur have 4 solid wheels each, and there's genuine scholarly debate over whether these heavy vehicles even functioned as true battle chariots in the sense of fast, manoeuvrable strike vehicles, or whether they were slower, sturdier transports used to carry high-ranking officers onto the field, more of a battlefield taxi than a weapon in themselves. Researchers who have tried to physically reconstruct these vehicles have pointed out that the wheels appear consistent with bent wood construction, meaning Sumerian craftsmen already understood how to steam or soak wood into curved shapes, evidence of which survives in an actual sledge frame recovered from the tomb of a Sumerian queen named Puabi. The floors were likely not solid wooden platforms, since standing rigidly on hard wood while being dragged at speed over rutted ground would be brutal. Instead, the floor may have been made of woven leather strips, offering a small amount of natural give, essentially a crude form of suspension, built thousands of years before anyone had a formal engineering concept of shock absorption. By roughly 3000 BCE, two-wheeled carts had also become common for simpler, everyday hauling, and full four-wheeled wagons were being used to move goods and people across the growing cities of Sumer. The wheels themselves, according to the Danish scholar Stephen Bertmann's research into Mesopotamian material culture, were commonly constructed from two half-discs of solid wood nailed firmly together and then wrapped in a covering of leather that functioned much the way a rubber tire functions today, cushioning the ride and protecting the wooden rim from wearing down too quickly against rough ground. The truly light, fast, spoked wheel, the kind that eventually made the war chariot into one of the most feared weapons of the ancient world, didn't arrive until much later, generally dated to around 2000 BCE, well over 1,000 years after the earliest solid wheels first appeared. This is worth pausing on because it tells you something honest about how invention actually works, as opposed to how it gets simplified in textbooks. There was no single moment where someone invented the wheel, and then humanity instantly had chariots and cars. There was a slow, uneven, centuries-long relay race of small improvements. Potter's disc, then heavy solid wheel, then bent wood construction, then leather tires, then finally, after 1,000 years of trial and adjustment, someone figured out that you could remove most of the solid wood from the wheel entirely and replace it with a small number of thin spokes radiating out from the hub, cutting the weight dramatically while keeping the strength. A lighter wheel meant a faster vehicle, and a faster vehicle pulled by domesticated horses, which had by this time become available in the region, meant you suddenly had a genuinely terrifying instrument of war. A chariot that could outrun infantry, wheel around a battlefield, and let an archer fire arrows from a stable, moving platform. That version of the wheel would go on to define warfare across the ancient Near East, Egypt, and the Mediterranean for well over 1,000 years, and its basic principle, a rigid rim connected to a hub by a small number of load-bearing spokes, is still literally how bicycle wheels are built today. It's genuinely remarkable, when you think about it, that a rotating disc invented to smooth out lopsided clay bowls in a potter's workshop eventually became the single most important mechanical principle in human transportation, load-bearing manufacturing, and machinery for the next 5,500 years. Every gear inside a clock, every turbine inside a power plant, every wheel on every car, truck, train, and airplane landing gear traces its lineage back to some anonymous craftsman in Mesopotamia who got tired of making crooked pots. And speaking of craftsmen getting tired of doing things the hard way, that same restless, practical drive to make daily tasks less exhausting is exactly what pushed another group of Sumerians to look at their farmland and completely reinvent how food itself got grown. Because right around the same era the wheel was rolling into daily use, someone else was busy attaching a very sharp point to the front of a wooden frame, and that decision alone would end up determining how much food a single family could produce, and by extension, how large a city could actually grow. Mathematics and the sexagesimal system, why we still count to 60. Before we get to farming, we need to talk about numbers, because the Sumerians didn't just invent writing, they invented an entire number system that is so deeply embedded in your daily life that you almost certainly used it within the last hour without realizing it. Nearly every ancient counting system humans developed independently around the world was based on 10, because we have 10 fingers. The Sumerians, strangely, did not settle on a base 10 system. They built their mathematics around the number 60 in what's called a sexagesimal system, and they didn't do this randomly. 60 can be evenly divided by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, while 10 can only be divided evenly by 2 and 5. For a farmer splitting a harvest among workers, or a merchant dividing payment among partners, 60 gives vastly more ways to split things into neat whole portions without awkward fractions. The earliest Sumerians tracked quantities using simple physical counting tokens, and then, as cuneiform developed, they represented numbers using a small set of marks pressed into clay. A particular wedge-shaped notch for the number 1, another shape for 10, made by rotating the stylus, and larger, distinct symbols for 60 and beyond. Early evidence even points to physical clay pieces of different shapes and sizes, a small cone representing 1 unit, a small clay ball representing 10 units, and a larger cone representing 60, used almost like a physical abacus before the fully abstract written numeral system matured. And in fact, a genuine early form of the abacus, a calculating device using beads or counters along a frame or grooves, is generally dated to sometime between 2700 and 2300 BCE in Mesopotamia, making it one of the oldest calculating tools in the archaeological record. This sexagesimal system was not some minor bureaucratic footnote. It became the mathematical backbone of Sumerian administration, allowing scribes to calculate taxes, divide harvests, measure land, and record trade with a level of precision that simply wasn't achievable using informal counting alone. By the time of the early dynastic period, Sumerian scribes were being trained rigorously in mathematics as a core part of their education, right alongside learning to read and write cuneiform itself, because a scribe's job was very often, at its core, an accounting job. And this is where the story becomes something you can personally verify without any special knowledge at all. Look at a clock right now. An hour is divided into 60 minutes. A minute is divided into 60 seconds. That is not a coincidence, and it is not something that emerged naturally from any physical property of time itself. It is a direct, unbroken inheritance from Sumerian mathematics passed down through the Babylonians, who inherited and expanded Sumerian numerical systems after Sumer's political independence ended, and from the Babylonians onward through Greek astronomers, who adopted Babylonian sexagesimal methods for their own astronomical calculations, and from there into the entire framework of Western timekeeping that eventually spread to nearly the whole planet. The same is true of the circle. A circle today is divided into 360 degrees. 360 is simply 6 lots of 60, and it almost certainly relates back to this same ancient sexagesimal tradition, likely reinforced by the ancient observation that the sun's yearly path against the background stars takes approximately 365 days, a number tantalizingly close to a clean, round 360. Every time a protractor is used in a school classroom anywhere on Earth today, whatever language that classroom is taught in, whatever country it's located in, the underlying number system tracing back to that measurement was first standardized by scribes working in the temples and palaces of cities like Uruk, Ur, and Nippur thousands of years before Greece, before Rome, before any of the civilizations most people learn about first in school. Sumerian mathematics went well beyond basic counting and time as well. Scribes developed methods for calculating area and volume that were essential for 2 enormous practical problems: dividing and measuring farmland fairly, and calculating how to dig, maintain, and distribute water through irrigation canals, which we'll get to shortly. According to research into Mesopotamian land measurement, scribes calculated the area of oddly shaped fields not by measuring angles, the way you might expect, but by measuring the lengths of the sides and breaking irregular shapes down into simpler, rectangular or triangular pieces, calculating each piece separately and then adding the results together. It's a strikingly practical, almost brute force method of doing geometry, prioritizing getting a correct usable answer for a real tax assessment over developing an elegant, abstract theory of shapes for its own sake. And here's a detail that tends to genuinely surprise people. The mathematical relationship we call the Pythagorean theorem today, the rule that lets you calculate the length of the diagonal side of a right triangle if you know the lengths of the other two sides, was already being used by Mesopotamian mathematicians well over 1,000 years before the Greek philosopher Pythagoras was even born. Clay tablets survive, containing tables of numbers that only make sense if the scribes who produced them already understood and were actively applying this exact mathematical relationship, likely for practical purposes like surveying land or calculating the dimensions of buildings and canals. Pythagoras, whatever his own contributions to Greek mathematics and philosophy actually were, did not discover this relationship from scratch. He was, at best, several steps removed from a mathematical tradition that had already been quietly working for well over a millennium in the temple archives of Mesopotamia. None of this happened because Sumerian scribes had some abstract love of pure numbers for their own sake. It happened because a growing, complex society needed to solve real problems. How much grain is owed? How much land does this family own? How do we split 60 jars of oil evenly among 7 households without anyone getting cheated? Mathematics in Sumer was invented to keep a massive bureaucracy honest and functional, and the specific system they landed on still governs how every person watching this measures time and angles today. Numbers on clay were one thing, but numbers on clay only matter if you can trust that the person handing you a tablet or a jar or a sealed container actually is who they claim to be and hasn't tampered with what's inside. And solving that very specific, very human problem of trust led the Sumerians to invent something you've probably seen sitting in a museum case without any idea of just how important it once was. A small cylindrical stone stamp that worked essentially as the world's first personal signature. Cylinder seals, the world's first signature. Picture a small stone cylinder, sometimes no bigger than your thumb, carved with tiny, intricate images, gods, animals, banquet scenes, mythological creatures locked in combat. Roll that cylinder across a strip of soft, wet clay, and the carved design presses into the surface in a continuous repeating band, a miniature relief image, precise and identical every time that particular cylinder is used. That object is a cylinder seal, and for well over 1,000 years, it functioned as something close to a fingerprint, a signature, and a wax seal all in one small portable object. Cylinder seals were used constantly and by nearly everyone, not just kings and priests, but ordinary merchants, labourers, and even people held in bondage whenever something needed to be marked as authentic. If you sealed a jar of oil for transport, rolling your personal cylinder seal across a strip of wet clay pressed over the stopper meant that anyone who broke that seal to tamper with the goods would leave obvious, undeniable evidence of the theft. If you wrote a legal contract, pressing your seal into the clay tablet at the bottom acted exactly the way a signature does on a modern legal document, a personal mark that verified you had agreed to these specific terms, and that couldn't easily be forged by someone else, since each seal's carved design was unique to its owner. Making a cylinder seal was a genuinely skilled craft, not something any random person could carve on their own. A dedicated seal cutter would apprentice under a master craftsman for a minimum of 4 years before being trusted to set up shop independently. Archaeologists have even recovered actual seal cutters' toolkits, preserved in clay jars, containing small copper chisels, fine-pointed copper tools for adding delicate detail work, whetstones for sharpening, and drilling tools for boring the hole through the centre of the cylinder so it could be threaded onto a cord and worn around the neck or wrist, or pinned onto clothing, kept close at hand for whenever it was needed. What's genuinely striking about cylinder seals is how they blur the line between bureaucratic tool and pure art. Some surviving examples are astonishingly detailed for objects this small, depicting entire mythological scenes, banquets, ritual processions, or combat between heroes and monstrous beasts, all carved in reverse, so intricate that the artisan had to essentially imagine the finished image backwards and inside out before ever touching the chisel to the stone. And this was not a niche, rarely used object confined to the elite of society. It was, quite literally, one of the most common personal possessions across the entire ancient Near East for thousands of years, spanning from roughly 3,500 BCE all the way through to around 300 BCE, adopted and adapted by nearly every culture that followed in Sumer's footsteps. This obsession with authentication, with proving that a specific person really did agree to a specific deal, or really did seal a specific jar, tells you something important about the kind of society Sumer had become by this point. It was a society with strangers in it. Not everyone doing business together was family, or from the same village, or someone you'd trust on a handshake alone. Cities like Uruk had grown large enough, and trade networks extensive enough, that people needed a reliable, tamper-resistant way to prove identity and agreement between individuals who might never have met before and might never meet again. That is, in essence, one of the oldest and most persistent problems any large complex civilization ever has to solve, and the Sumerians solved it with a small rolled stone and some wet clay, long before anyone had a word for notarization, contracts, or fraud prevention. And once you understand just how seriously the Sumerians took the business of growing enough food to support cities this large, it starts to make sense why they needed such an obsessive system of contracts, receipts, and personal seals in the first place. Because behind every jar of oil, every measure of grain, and every plot of farmland being bought, sold, rented, or fought over, there was an entire agricultural system that had to be built, quite literally, from nothing, in one of the least forgiving environments in the ancient world. Irrigation and the plough, taming two unforgiving rivers. Southern Mesopotamia, the heartland of Sumer, is not naturally hospitable for growing crops. It's flat, hot, and rainfall is scarce and unreliable for most of the year. But running through this landscape are two enormous rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and this is where the phrase "the Fertile Crescent" actually comes from. The rivers carried rich silt down from the mountains further north, and if that silt could be reliably delivered to farmland at the right time and amount, the soil became extraordinarily productive. The problem was that the rivers did not cooperate on any convenient schedule. Both the Tigris and the Euphrates flooded on a roughly annual basis, and these floods were violent and unpredictable rather than gentle and reliable. A flood arriving too early or too late, too large or too small, could just as easily destroy an entire season's crops, drown livestock, and wreck houses as it could nourish the fields. The earliest farming communities settling in this region were essentially living at the mercy of two rivers that could either make them rich or wipe them out entirely, with very little warning either way. The Sumerian solution to this problem was one of the most consequential engineering achievements in human history, even though it doesn't get anywhere near the attention that the wheel or writing usually receives. They built irrigation, not casual, small-scale irrigation, but an extensive, deliberately engineered network of canals designed to intercept river water before it could flood unpredictably and redirect it into smaller, controllable channels that could deliver water to farmland exactly where and when it was needed. Around the ancient city of Uruk alone, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of substantial canal systems and reservoirs, evidence of a genuinely large-scale, coordinated engineering project rather than a handful of farmers digging individual ditches on their own initiative. This required cooperation on a scale that a single family or even a single village simply could not manage alone. Digging, maintaining and regulating a network of canals large enough to serve an entire region meant organising labour across many different communities, settling disputes over who got water and when, and maintaining constant vigilance against silt build-up, which would clog channels over time and had to be dredged out repeatedly. Some of the very earliest administrative cuneiform tablets we have, in fact, are labour records concerning workers assigned specifically to irrigation projects, further proof of just how central this infrastructure was to how Sumerian government and bureaucracy actually functioned in daily practice. To physically move water uphill or lift it out of a canal into a higher field that gravity alone wouldn't reach, Sumerian farmers used a device called a shaduf, essentially a long pole balanced on a pivot, with a bucket on one end and a counterweight on the other, allowing a single person to lift and swing water from a lower source into a higher channel with relatively modest physical effort. This simple lever-based device, first appearing in the region around 3000 BCE, remained in continuous use across the Middle East for thousands of years afterward, and remarkably, versions of it are still used by small-scale farmers in parts of the world today, essentially unchanged in basic design from a tool developed 5,000 years ago. Alongside irrigation, the Sumerians developed and refined the plough, and this invention deserves real attention because it fundamentally changed the physical relationship between human beings and the food they grew. Before the plough, breaking up hard, dry soil to prepare it for planting had to be done largely by hand, using digging sticks, hoes, or simple hand tools. A slow and physically exhausting process that placed a hard ceiling on how much land any single family could realistically farm. The earliest Sumerian plough appeared around 3500 BCE, and it worked by harnessing the far greater strength of domesticated oxen to drag a wooden frame fitted with a sharpened point through the soil, breaking and turning it in long furrows far faster and with far less human exhaustion than digging by hand ever could. But the true masterpiece of Sumerian agricultural engineering, and one of the most genuinely clever pieces of technology to come out of the ancient world, was what's often called the cedar plough, which appears in the historical record by around 1500 BCE, though some elements of the design likely developed earlier. A standard plough breaks up soil and cuts a furrow, but a farmer still then has to walk behind it separately, scattering seed by hand, and that seed often ends up unevenly distributed, some of it too shallow to survive, some of it wasted on the surface where birds could pick it off before it even had a chance to sprout. The Sumerian cedar plough solved this by attaching a funnel directly to the plough itself, positioned so that as the plough's blade cut open the earth, seed fed down through the funnel and dropped directly into the fresh furrow at a controlled, even rate, immediately ready to be covered over by the very next pass of the plough or a subsequent crossing pass. Planting and tilling, two separate labour-intensive stages of farming, had been combined into a single continuous operation. Operating this cedar plough was itself a coordinated, almost ceremonial task. Historical accounts describe a team of farmers working together, one person leading and guiding the oxen, one person steering and controlling the plough itself to keep the furrow straight and at the correct depth, and a third person managing the seed, feeding it steadily through the funnel to keep the flow consistent. According to surviving accounts, the beginning of the sowing season in Sumer was treated as a significant, almost sacred event, sometimes inaugurated with a ceremony in which the king himself would take hold of the plough's handle after offering sacrifices, a ritual gesture meant to invoke divine favour over the coming harvest, before the actual farm labourers took over the real, sustained work of ploughing the fields. What might be the single most remarkable detail about Sumerian farming, though, is that we don't have to guess how any of this was done. We have the instructions, written down. A surviving Sumerian text, generally referred to by translators as something like the Farmer's Almanac or Instructions to a Farmer, walks through an entire agricultural year in careful, methodical detail, covering the flooding of fields before sowing, the correct method and timing of ploughing, how densely to space the furrows, when and how often to irrigate the growing barley, and finally, how to properly harvest, bind, and thresh the grain once it matured. This text has been compared by scholars to much later agricultural writings from Greek and Roman antiquity, works like Hesiod's poem on farming life or Virgil's agricultural verses, except the Sumerian version predates those famous later works by well over 2,000 years. It reads less like poetry and more like a genuinely practical instruction manual, a farmer literally passing down hard-won agricultural knowledge in writing so that future generations wouldn't have to relearn every lesson through their own costly trial and error. Harvest itself, according to surviving records, was handled through a carefully organized division of labor. Teams of 3 workers moved through the fields together. A reaper, who cut the standing grain, a binder, who gathered and tied the cut stalks into manageable bundles, and a 3rd worker, sometimes described as an arranger of sheaves, who organized and stacked the bound bundles for transport. After the harvest was gathered, the grain still had to be separated from the surrounding husks and stalks, a process accomplished using threshing wagons, essentially heavy sledges that oxen dragged repeatedly over the piled stalks to break the tough outer husks apart, followed by winnowing, where workers would toss the loosened mixture of grain and chaff into the air, allowing the wind to carry away the lighter husks while the heavier, edible grain fell straight back down to be collected. The cumulative effect of irrigation, the plough, the cedar plough, and this organized, almost industrial approach to harvest labor was staggering. Land that would otherwise have supported only a scattering of subsistence farmers could now reliably feed a genuine surplus of people. And that surplus is the single ingredient every city on Earth has always required before it could exist at all. You cannot have priests, scribes, soldiers, craftsmen, or merchants unless someone else's farming is productive enough to feed all of them in addition to feeding themselves. Every non-farmer walking the streets of Uruk, Ur, or Lagash, and there would eventually be tens of thousands of them, was alive and free to do something other than farm, precisely because Sumerian irrigation engineers and agricultural innovators had already solved the problem of growing far more food than farmers alone could ever eat. And once you have cities full of people who are not farmers, full of merchants, craftsmen, and specialists producing goods far beyond what any one household could make for itself, you very quickly run into a new problem entirely. How do you move all of that surplus, all of those goods, across long distances to trade with other cities and other peoples, especially when your entire civilization sits along the banks of 2 enormous rivers that happen to connect much of the region together? And that brings us to a Sumerian invention that quite literally changed the shape of trade and exploration for the rest of human history: the sailboat. The sailboat, reaching beyond the horizon. There's a certain kind of courage involved in the first time a human being decided to stop hugging the riverbank and instead trust a piece of cloth caught by the wind to carry them somewhere they couldn't see yet. The Sumerians took that step remarkably early, and the consequences of that decision rippled out across an enormous stretch of the ancient world, connecting cultures separated by hundreds of miles of open water. Boats of some kind almost certainly existed in Mesopotamia before sails did, probably simple rafts or reed vessels used to cross the Tigris and Euphrates or to fish along their banks. But the addition of a sail, a way to harness wind power instead of relying purely on paddling or poling against a current, transformed river travel into something far more ambitious: real, long-distance maritime trade. Wind, unlike human muscle, doesn't get tired, and a good sail could move heavier cargo faster, and over far greater distances than a team of paddlers ever could manage on their own. This mattered enormously for one simple reason. The Sumerians desperately needed things that did not exist anywhere near where they lived. Southern Mesopotamia is an alluvial floodplain, extraordinarily fertile for growing grain, but almost completely lacking in two things every early civilization craved: stone for construction and monuments, and metal for tools and weapons. There is essentially no natural copper, tin, or usable timber to be found in the immediate region around cities like Uruk, or Lagash. Everything the Sumerians needed to build with wood or metal had to come from somewhere else, often somewhere very far away, and the sailboat was what made bringing it home actually feasible on a large scale. What emerged over the following centuries was a genuinely impressive trade network stretching across the Persian Gulf, connecting Mesopotamia to distant lands the Sumerians referred to in their own texts by specific names. One of these was Dilmun, generally identified today with the island of Bahrain and the surrounding coast of eastern Arabia, which functioned as a crucial trading hub and transshipment point, a kind of ancient middleman port where goods coming from even further away could be gathered, stored, and passed along toward Mesopotamia. Another was Magan, generally identified with the region of modern-day Oman and the United Arab Emirates, which was itself a valuable source of raw copper ore and quality timber suitable for shipbuilding. And beyond even that, Sumerian and later Akkadian texts mention a place called Meluha, a land far more distant and mysterious to the Mesopotamians themselves, which many scholars now connect to the Indus Valley civilization, an entirely separate and remarkably sophisticated urban culture that flourished in what is today Pakistan and northwestern India. The physical evidence of this network is genuinely remarkable to consider. Archaeologists working at coastal sites along the Persian Gulf, including a location near the modern city of Jubail in Saudi Arabia, have recovered actual physical remains of ancient boats that plied these exact trade routes thousands of years ago. Surviving Sumerian records describe cargo ships from Magan capable of carrying loads of around 20 tons, sailing up along the coastline, stopping at Dilmun to resupply with fresh water, before continuing on toward the ports of Mesopotamia. 20 tons of cargo, moved by sail and manpower across open and coastal waters, using vessels built more than 4,000 years ago, is not a modest achievement by any measure. The goods flowing through this network tell their own story about what an ancient economy actually valued. Copper flowed north from Magan, essential for making tools, weapons, and eventually bronze, once tin was added to the mix. Fine decorative goods flowed from further afield: ivory combs, carnelian beads, and other luxury items that were carried by sea to Dilmun, where merchants from cities like would purchase them and carry them onward up the Euphrates into the Mesopotamian heartland. Even more strikingly, archaeologists have recovered actual stamp seals originating from the distant Indus Valley civilization at sites within Sumerian cities themselves, physical proof that objects, and quite likely people, travelled the full length of this network, connecting two entirely separate ancient civilizations that otherwise had no direct geographic contact at all. This trade wasn't run purely as a state monopoly either, though the palace and temple certainly took their share through taxes and tithes. Surviving records describe how individual merchants would pool their own private capital together, contributing goods like silver or sesame oil as investment in order to finance the substantial cost and risk of a long-distance copper-buying expedition to Magan. Once the copper was acquired and successfully brought home, the merchants would sell it and split the proceeds among themselves according to their original investment, an arrangement that looks remarkably similar to a modern joint venture or investment partnership worked out by people who had never heard the word shareholder but clearly understood the underlying concept perfectly well. Later, Mesopotamian rulers understood exactly how valuable this maritime trade was and made a point of publicly celebrating their control over it. One especially striking piece of evidence comes from a tablet describing the achievements of the great Akkadian king Sargon, who ruled a vast empire built partly on the foundations of the Sumerian city-states he had conquered, sometime in the 24th century BCE. According to this inscription, Sargon boasted that he had moored ships from Meluha, Magan, and Dilmun at the docks of his own capital city, a direct and deliberate flex, in the most literal sense, about how far his political and economic reach genuinely extended all the way to the distant, half-mythical lands at the far end of the maritime trade network the Sumerians had pioneered centuries before him. This entire trading system would eventually decline and shift over the following centuries, as new land routes opened up connecting India to the Mediterranean by an entirely different path, and as the fortunes of Mesopotamian cities themselves rose and fell. But the basic principle the Sumerians had proven, that a sail-powered boat could reliably connect distant economies separated by open water, and that this connection could be organized, financed, and taxed as a systematic part of a functioning economy rather than a series of one-off lucky voyages, remained a permanent addition to how human beings understood trade and distance from that point forward. And it's worth sitting with the scale of what all this trade, farming, writing, and mathematics eventually produced, because it didn't just create wealthy individuals. It created something the world had genuinely never seen before at this size and complexity. It created cities, real cities, with populations in the tens of thousands, walled, planned, governed, and organized in ways that would have been utterly unimaginable to the small farming villages that existed in this exact same region only a handful of centuries earlier. And once you have a city that large, you very quickly need something else entirely. A system of laws, a system of government, and, as we're about to see, some genuinely brutal lessons in what happens when that system gets it wrong. The city itself, Uruk, and the birth of urban life. It's easy to say the Sumerians invented the city and let that phrase slide past without really absorbing what it means, so let's slow down on this one, because it might be the largest and most consequential invention on this entire list, even though you can't hold it in your hand the way you can hold a cylinder seal or a clay tablet. For the overwhelming majority of human history before Sumer, people lived in small groups. Hunting bands, farming villages, extended family clusters numbering in the dozens or low hundreds at most. These communities were governed informally through kinship, tradition, and the direct face-to-face authority of elders or chiefs who genuinely knew every single person under their guidance personally. That kind of governance simply does not scale. It cannot manage 10,000 strangers living crammed together, drawing water from shared wells, disposing of shared waste, worshipping in shared temples, and depending on food grown by farmers most of them will never personally meet. The city of Uruk, located in what is now southern Iraq, is widely regarded by archaeologists and historians as the first true city in human history, or at the very least among the first handful of genuine contenders for that title anywhere on Earth. By around 3100 BCE, Uruk may have housed somewhere in the range of 50,000 people within its walls. An almost incomprehensible population density for this early period, achieved entirely because of the agricultural surplus we already discussed, and the administrative innovations, writing and mathematics chief among them, that allowed that surplus to be tracked, taxed, stored, and redistributed fairly across an enormous and largely anonymous population. Uruk had monumental temple architecture rising above the mud brick houses of ordinary citizens, dedicated to gods like Inanna and Anu, the great deities of the Sumerian pantheon, associated respectively with love, war, and the sky. It had defensive walls encircling the settlement, walls so significant that later Sumerian legend directly credited the construction of Uruk's walls to the legendary King Gilgamesh himself, framing the fortification of the city as one of his greatest and most enduring achievements, more permanent even than his own personal quest for immortality. It had distinct districts, organized labor, and a genuine social hierarchy, with priests, administrators, craftsmen, and laborers all occupying distinct roles within a single interconnected urban system, rather than everyone simply doing a bit of everything the way a small self-sufficient farming village typically would. Uruk was not alone for long. Other Sumerian cities rose alongside and after it: Eridu, Lagash, Nippur, Kish, and Umma, among others, each functioning essentially as an independent city-state, with its own ruling dynasty, its own patron deity, its own walls, and frequently its own rivalries and outright wars with its neighbouring city-states. This is worth pausing on because it corrects a common misconception people sometimes have about ancient Sumer, imagining it as one single unified nation the way we might imagine a modern country. It wasn't, not for most of its early history. Sumer was a patchwork of competing independent city-states, sharing a broadly common language, religion, and culture, but frequently at each other's throats over water rights, border territory, and raw political ambition, not unlike the fiercely independent city-states of later Greece. This constant competition between city-states, as it turns out, was itself a powerful engine of invention. When wanted to outshine Uruk, when Lagash wanted to outmaneuver Umma, rulers had every incentive to fund bigger temples, better canals, stronger city walls, more efficient bureaucracies, and more effective armies. Innovation in Sumer wasn't purely the product of individual genius working in isolation. A great deal of it was the direct result of intense, sustained, city versus city rivalry, each side pushing the other to build faster, organize better, and fight smarter, purely to avoid being outdone or outright conquered by their neighbour down the river. And when city-states compete that intensely for that long, sooner or later, something breaks. Grievances build up. Wars get fought over the same disputed strip of farmland for generations. Kings make promises they don't keep, and citizens start looking for some kind of formal, written guarantee that the powerful people ruling over them can actually be held accountable to a fixed, known standard, rather than to whatever mood the king happens to be in on any given day. And that need, the need for a written, public, permanent standard of justice that even a king couldn't simply ignore, is exactly what pushed Sumer toward inventing something that still shapes nearly every courtroom on Earth today: the very first written law codes in human history. The Code of Ur-Nammu, the world's first written laws. Before this next section, a quick note. Some of what we're about to describe involves ancient punishments for crimes including sexual violence. We're going to walk through this carefully and respectfully, focusing on what these laws tell us about how one of the earliest civilizations tried to build justice from nothing, rather than dwelling on graphic detail. Sometime around 2100 to 2500 BCE, a king named Ur-Nammu, founder of what's often called the Third Dynasty of Ur, one of the great political powers to rise out of Sumer, ordered something written down that no one on earth had ever successfully written down before, at least not in a form that survives to us today. A complete, structured, written set of laws, applying not just to a single case or a single dispute, but as a general standard meant to govern an entire kingdom. We know there was likely an earlier attempt at this. A ruler named Urukagina, who governed the city of Lagash, roughly 2 centuries before Ur-Nammu, is remembered in later Sumerian texts as having introduced legal and social reforms of his own, reportedly aimed at correcting abuses of power by corrupt officials and protecting ordinary citizens from exploitation. But the actual content of Urukagina's reforms has not survived. We only know they existed because later writers referenced them. Ur-Nammu's code, by contrast, survives in fragments substantial enough that modern scholars have been able to reconstruct roughly 30 to 40 of its original laws, making it, as far as archaeology can currently prove, the oldest written law code that has actually survived into the present day, predating the far more famous Code of Hammurabi by roughly 3 centuries. The code opens, as was apparently standard practice for Mesopotamian law codes generally, with a prologue rather than jumping straight into rules and punishments. In this prologue, Ur-Nammu doesn't present himself as simply inventing laws out of his own personal authority. He frames his kingship as granted by the gods Nana and Utu, and he describes his legal reforms as an act of establishing what he calls equity in the land. He specifically claims, in language that has survived remarkably intact, that he banished malediction, violence, and strife from his kingdom, and in a passage that genuinely reads like a ruler consciously building his own legacy, states plainly that the orphan was not delivered up to the rich man, the widow was not delivered up to the mighty man, and the man of 1 shekel was not delivered up to the man of 1 mina, meaning that a person of modest means was not to be crushed or exploited, simply because someone else possessed 60 times their wealth. That last detail matters enormously because it tells you exactly what problem Ur-Nammu was trying to solve with this code. Before written law, justice in a growing, complex society like Sumer almost certainly depended heavily on informal power. A poor farmer with a grievance against a wealthy landowner, or a widow trying to protect her inheritance from a scheming relative, had very little real recourse if the powerful person on the other side of the dispute could simply lean on local custom, personal connections, or outright intimidation to get their way. A written code, publicly known and consistently applied, at least in theory, gave ordinary people something solid to point to. This is the law. This is what happens if you do this. It applies to you the same as it applies to me. The structure of the code itself set a pattern that would go on to shape legal writing for thousands of years afterward, right up to the present day. Nearly every law is framed in a simple conditional structure. If a certain action occurs, then a certain consequence follows. If a man commits a specific crime, then a specific punishment is applied. This if-then format, sometimes called casuistic law by scholars, might look almost too obvious to call an invention at all, since it seems like the only logical way to write a rule down. But someone had to be the first person to actually do it, to formalize legal reasoning into this precise, repeatable structure. And as far as the archaeological record shows us, that someone was working in the court of Ur-Nammu, or possibly under his son and successor Shulgi, nearly 4,000 years ago. Now here's where the details get genuinely gripping, because reading through the actual surviving laws feels less like reading dry legal text and more like getting a direct, unfiltered window into exactly what kept ancient Sumerian society up at night. The code addresses murder directly and without ambiguity. If a man takes another person's life, that man is to be put to death. Robbery carried the same ultimate penalty. These were treated as capital offences, meaning the harshest possible punishment the state could apply, with no fine or compensation considered sufficient to make up for the crime. But here is what makes the code of Ur-Nammu genuinely remarkable compared to the more famous Babylonian legal tradition that followed it. For the vast majority of lesser offences, injuries, disputes and damages, this code did not rely on the punishment principle you've probably heard summarized as an eye for an eye. That later approach, called lex talionis by scholars, meaning a punishment that mirrors the injury committed, physical harm answered with equivalent physical harm, would become the dominant approach roughly 3 centuries later under the Babylonian king Hammurabi. Ur-Nammu's earlier code took a strikingly different and in many ways more restrained path. Instead of demanding that a person who injured someone else's body suffer an identical injury in return, the code generally imposed fines, paid in silver or in measures of grain, as compensation to the injured party. Consider what survives of the laws dealing with physical assault. If a man severed another man's foot with a weapon, the punishment recorded was a fine, paid in silver, rather than the attacker's own foot being severed in return. If a man broke another man's bone using a weapon, again, the response was a monetary fine rather than a matching broken bone inflicted on the offender. This is a genuinely significant philosophical choice, whether Ur-Nammu or his advisors fully understood it in these terms or not. It treats justice as something that can, in many cases, be satisfied through compensation to the victim, rather than exclusively through mirrored suffering inflicted on the guilty party. Scholars studying the code have specifically noted that this approach, prioritizing monetary restitution over strict physical retaliation for most bodily injuries, was in some ways more progressive than what came later, even though it emerged from a society that most people today would recognize as harshly unequal and, by modern standards, genuinely brutal in other respects. And that brutality is very real and worth being honest about, because it's part of what makes this code such a fascinating, unsettling document. The code did not treat all human lives as equal. Sumerian society under Ur-Nammu was structured around a fundamental division between free people and enslaved people, and the law codified that division with cold precision. If a man violated the personal rights of another man's female slave, the punishment recorded was a modest fine paid in silver, a punishment dramatically lighter than what was prescribed for the same act committed against a free woman, which could carry the penalty of death. The value the law placed on a human life, in other words, depended heavily on whether that life belonged to a free citizen or to someone held in bondage, and reading through these distinctions today is a genuinely uncomfortable reminder of just how deeply inequality was baked into even this remarkably early attempt at written justice. There are other details in the surviving fragments that reveal an almost startlingly intimate picture of daily Sumerian anxieties and disputes. There is a specific law addressing what happens if someone falsely accuses another person's wife of being unfaithful. If the accusation could not be proven and the accused woman's innocence was confirmed, it was the accuser, not the woman, who faced a financial penalty, required to pay a set amount of silver as a consequence for making a false and damaging claim. This detail matters because it shows the code was concerned not just with punishing genuine wrongdoing, but with actively discouraging malicious, unfounded accusations from being weaponized against innocent people, a concern that remains completely recognizable in legal systems operating today. Perhaps the single most striking method used by this code to determine guilt or innocence in cases where evidence was unclear involved something called the river ordeal. If a man was accused of a serious crime such as sorcery, or if a wife was accused by her husband of infidelity and no clear proof existed either way, the accused person could be required to undergo trial by water. The specifics of exactly how this ordeal worked have not survived in complete detail, but the general principle, found across many ancient Near Eastern legal traditions, involved submitting the accused person to the river itself, with survival or a particular physical outcome interpreted as divine proof of innocence and the reverse interpreted as proof of guilt. If the accused survived and was proven innocent through this ordeal, the accuser once again was required to pay a financial penalty to the person they had wrongly accused, a striking repeated pattern throughout this code, punishing false accusation nearly as seriously as it punished the underlying crime being falsely alleged. The code also addressed the mundane, unglamorous realities of daily married and family life with a bluntness that feels startlingly modern. There were specific fixed fines set for divorce, with a man required to pay 1 full mina of silver, equivalent to 60 shekels, if he divorced his first wife, but only half a mina if he divorced a subsequent wife, suggesting some kind of legally recognized distinction in status between a first marriage and later ones. There were rules governing what happened to children born to enslaved parents who were later granted freedom, rules about property inheritance, and even, in one especially unusual surviving fragment, an extraordinarily specific, and by modern standards, deeply strange punishment prescribed for a female slave, who compared herself favourably to her mistress, in which her mouth was to be filled with salt. Ur-Nammu also used his code to standardize weights and measures across his kingdom, fixing exactly how much silver constituted 1 shekel, how many shekels constituted 1 mina, and establishing standard measures for grain and other commodities. This might sound like a minor administrative footnote compared to laws about murder and assault, but it was arguably just as important to daily life for ordinary Sumerians. A merchant selling grain in one city needed to know that a measure called a gur meant the exact same quantity in the next city over, or trade itself would become a constant, exhausting negotiation over whose measuring standard to trust. Standardizing weights and measures under royal authority meant that for the first time, an entire kingdom could trade, tax, and do business using a single, trusted, consistent system backed by the authority of the king himself. What's genuinely remarkable, looking back at all of this from several thousand years later, is how deliberately Ur-Nammu seems to have understood the value of being remembered as a just ruler, not merely a powerful one. He didn't simply conquer, tax, and rule by force, at least not according to how he chose to present himself in his own official record. He built canals, restored temples damaged by decades of war and instability under the previous Gutian rulers who had briefly disrupted Sumerian civilization, and then deliberately, permanently carved a written promise into clay that even he, the king, would be bound by a known, fixed public standard of justice. Whether Ur-Nammu himself always lived up to that promise in practice is something we obviously cannot fully verify from 4,000 years away. But the fact that he felt the need to make that promise at all, in writing, permanently, tells you something enormously important about how far Sumerian civilization had already travelled from the kind of arbitrary, personal rule that likely governed the earliest, smallest human communities. This code did not disappear into obscurity either. Roughly 3 centuries later, a similar but far longer and more famous legal code would be carved into a massive stone pillar under the authority of the Babylonian king Hammurabi, a document today housed in the Louvre Museum in Paris, and one that most people have actually heard of, even if they've never heard of Ur-Nammu himself. Hammurabi's code would take a notably harsher approach in many places, embracing that eye for an eye principle of matching mirrored physical punishment far more consistently than Ur-Nammu's earlier code had. But the entire underlying structure, the if-then format, the prologue invoking divine authority, the standardizing of weights and measures, the very idea that a king's justice should be written down, public and permanent rather than private and arbitrary, all of it traces directly back to Ur-Nammu and the scribes of Ur, working roughly 4,000 years ago in a kingdom that most people today have simply never had a reason to learn about. And once a society starts writing down formal, enforceable rules for how people are expected to treat each other, it very quickly needs somewhere to actually enforce those rules, argue over them, and settle disputes when accusations fly back and forth. Which brings us to something else buried in the Sumerian record that genuinely deserves more attention than it usually gets. The world's oldest documented legal court case, complete with named plaintiffs, named witnesses, and a verdict that has survived on clay for roughly 4,000 years. The Nippur murder trial, the world's oldest recorded court case. Quick note before we get into this one. It involves a killing and a difficult moral question about a spouse's silence. We'll handle the details plainly and without dwelling on anything graphic. Sometime around 1850 BCE, in the city of Nippur, a man named Lu Inanna was killed by 3 other men. Their names have survived on the clay tablets recording this case with startling clarity: Nana Sig, Ku Enlil, and Enlil Enam. After the killing, these 3 men did something that, on its own, might have gone completely unrecorded and unremarked by history. They went and told the victim's wife, a woman named Nindada, exactly what they had done to her husband. And here is where the case becomes genuinely fascinating, and where you start to feel, across 4,000 years, the presence of a real, specific, complicated human decision. Nindada did not report the murder. She said nothing to the authorities. She kept the secret of her husband's death and the identity of his killers entirely to herself. Eventually, however it happened, whether through a slip of the tongue somewhere, a witness who overheard something, or simple bad luck, the truth came out, and all 4 people involved, the 3 killers and the silent widow, were brought before the highest available legal authority. The case was presented to Ur-Ninurta, who ruled over the region from his capital at the city of Isin around this period, and rather than deciding the matter with his own personal royal judgment, the king exercised what appears to have been his formal prerogative, and referred the entire case down to the city assembly of Nippur, essentially a body of citizens acting as a court, to conduct the actual trial and reach a verdict. What survives from this trial reads almost exactly like a transcript of courtroom argument, which is remarkable enough on its own that we should sit with it for a moment. This is not a summary written by a historian centuries later, guessing at what might have been argued. This is, as far as scholars can tell, something close to a direct record, or at minimum a faithful literary reconstruction based closely on an actual case, of the arguments made in an actual ancient courtroom, preserved in the exact language used at the time. 9 men rose in the assembly to argue for the prosecution. Their position was severe and uncompromising. Not only should the 3 men who had actually carried out the killing be executed, but the wife, despite having played no direct role in the murder itself, should be executed as well, specifically for concealing the crime rather than reporting it, and the record specifies that this execution was to take place before what's described as Lu Inanna's chair, likely meaning at some kind of memorial site or symbolic location connected to the dead man himself, a detail that adds a genuinely eerie, almost theatrical weight to the proposed punishment. But the case did not end there, and this is the detail that makes this ancient trial feel remarkably, almost uncomfortably familiar to anyone who has ever watched a modern courtroom drama. 2 other men then stood up in the same assembly specifically to argue in the widow's defense. Their argument was narrow and specific. Whatever else might be true, Nindada herself had not participated in her husband's murder. She had not planned it, she had not carried it out, and she had not benefited from it in any way beyond, presumably, being spared the difficulty of navigating whatever situation had led 3 men to kill her husband and then feel compelled to tell her about it. On these grounds, her defenders argued that she should not share the same fate as the men who had actually committed the killing. We know almost nothing definitively about why Nindada stayed silent, and that gap is exactly what makes the case so hauntingly incomplete, even 4,000 years later. Was she afraid of these 3 men, who clearly knew where she lived and had no hesitation about confronting her directly after committing a killing? Was there some deeper relationship or unspoken tension between her and her husband, or between her and one of his killers, that we simply cannot recover from the surviving fragments? Was she simply too frightened, too shocked, or too uncertain of what reporting the crime might mean for her own safety to say anything at all? The tablet doesn't tell us, and we have no way of finding out. What we do know, with certainty, is that an actual Sumerian legal assembly, roughly 4,000 years ago, wrestled seriously and publicly with a genuinely difficult legal and moral question that still comes up in courtrooms today. How much responsibility does a person bear for staying silent about a crime they did not commit but knew about and said nothing? This case has become one of the most heavily discussed pieces of Sumerian legal literature precisely because of how sophisticated the underlying legal reasoning appears to be. Scholars examining the surviving text have pointed to specific grammatical structures within the Sumerian language itself, particular verbal forms used by the speakers in the assembly that appear to convey subtle differences between certainty, speculation, and deduction, essentially different shades of how confident a speaker is in the claim they're making. In other words, the Sumerian scribes and orators involved in this case weren't simply stating flat accusations. They were engaging in nuanced, carefully calibrated legal argumentation, distinguishing between what they knew for certain and what they merely suspected or inferred, in a manner that legal scholars today recognize as genuinely sophisticated jurisprudential reasoning, not simply crude accusation and denial. It's also worth knowing that this particular case survives to us specifically because it was used as a teaching tool. Fragments of the tablet recording this trial were found among training materials used to instruct young scribes in formal legal reasoning and proper document formatting, alongside other model court cases meant to serve as templates or examples. This tells us something important. The Nippur murder trial wasn't simply an isolated sensational event that happened to get written down by chance. It was considered by the Sumerians themselves to be a genuinely instructive example of how legal argument should be conducted, significant enough that it was deliberately preserved and taught to the next generation of scribes as a model to study and learn from. We don't have the final verdict from this trial preserved in the surviving fragments, which is its own kind of small tragedy, honestly, because it means that after 4,000 years, we still don't know for certain whether Nindada was executed alongside the 3 men who killed her husband, or whether the argument made in her defense actually succeeded in sparing her life. What we're left with instead is something arguably more valuable than a simple verdict: direct, textured evidence that Sumerian justice, even at this astonishingly early period in human history, was not simply a matter of a king pointing a finger and pronouncing a sentence. It involved organized public argument, competing perspectives presented by different advocates, careful, deliberate distinctions between direct guilt and secondary complicity, and a genuine, structured process, however imperfect by modern standards, for weighing evidence and reaching a considered decision. And speaking of complicated, deeply human legal disputes preserved on Sumerian clay, this trial is far from the only surviving example of Sumerians turning to the written word to settle disagreements. Because alongside murder trials and formal law codes, the Sumerians left behind something considerably more mundane, and in its own way, just as revealing about ordinary daily life: complaint letters, personal grievances, and consumer disputes, essentially the ancient version of writing an angry review, except pressed into wet clay and dried into permanence nearly 4,000 years before online reviews ever existed. The complaint tablet to Ea Nasir, the world's first one-star review. Around 1750 BCE, in the city of Ur, a man named Nani sat down, or more likely dictated to a scribe, one of the angriest, most quietly hilarious pieces of writing to survive from the ancient world. He was writing to a copper merchant named Ea Nasir, and he was, by any reasonable modern standard, absolutely done with this man's business practices. The backstory is straightforward enough. Ea Nasir was part of a guild of merchants who made the long, difficult and expensive voyage down to Dilmun to purchase copper, the very same trade route we discussed earlier connecting Mesopotamia to the Persian Gulf. According to the tablet, Nasir had personally promised Nani that he would deliver fine-quality copper ingots. Nani sent his own servant along with payment to complete the transaction, trusting that promise. What arrived instead, according to Nani's own furious account, was copper of a noticeably lower grade, and when Nani's servant tried to raise the issue at the point of delivery, Nasir's alleged response was somewhere between dismissive and openly contemptuous, essentially telling the servant to take the inferior copper or leave it. What follows in the surviving text is a genuinely remarkable piece of ancient consumer outrage, preserved in Akkadian cuneiform on a small clay tablet roughly the size of your palm. Nani doesn't hold back. He directly questions what kind of person Nasir must think he is, to be treated with this level of disrespect. He describes sending messengers to recover money he was owed, only to have those messengers turned away empty-handed, repeatedly, and forced to travel back through what he specifically describes as hostile or dangerous territory to do so. He points out, with clear and pointed indignation, that he has personally contributed a substantial quantity of copper, over £1,000 by his own account, to the palace on Nasir's behalf, essentially reminding the merchant of exactly how much goodwill and cooperation he has already extended, only to be repaid with what he considered outright contempt. And then Nani delivers what might be the single most quotable line to survive from the entire history of ancient Mesopotamian commerce, a closing declaration that from this point forward he will personally inspect every single copper ingot himself in his own yard rather than trust Nasir's judgment ever again, and that he intends to exercise what he calls his right of rejection, precisely because he has been treated with such open disregard. What makes this tablet so genuinely captivating, beyond simply being old, is that it isn't an isolated grievance. It was discovered, along with a whole collection of similarly frustrated correspondence, inside what archaeologists believe was Nasir's own house, excavated during the early 20th century expedition led by the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley, the very same excavator who uncovered the Standard of and the royal tombs we discussed earlier. Among these other tablets are additional complaints from different customers entirely, men with names like Imgur Sin and Arbituram, each independently frustrated with the same merchant over what appears to be a persistent, ongoing pattern of shipping inferior copper and mishandling customer disputes. One customer, in a separate surviving tablet, essentially demands to know why he hasn't received copper he already paid for, in language that translates almost directly into a modern customer angrily asking where their order is. In other words, Nasir wasn't simply the target of one unusually furious customer having a uniquely bad day. Based on the sheer volume and consistency of complaints found specifically within his own household archive, it appears he had developed something close to a genuine, lasting reputation in as an unreliable business partner, someone whose customers had learned, through repeated bitter experience, to distrust his promises about product quality. This tablet has, understandably, become something of an internet phenomenon in recent years, since discovering that the exact same frustrations we experience today with bad customer service and unfulfilled promises were being expressed in almost identical emotional terms by an actual human being who lived and breathed and did business nearly 4,000 years ago is a genuinely startling thing to confront. Nani's anger has outlived him by roughly 3,500 years, permanently preserved because he happened to be angry in a civilization that had already figured out how to write things down. It's a small, almost comedic footnote in the grand story of Sumerian achievement, but it earns its place here because it demonstrates something genuinely important about why writing mattered so much to begin with. The Sumerians didn't just use their new invention for grand royal inscriptions and sweeping law codes. They used it for exactly what you'd expect literate, commercially minded people to use it for: keeping receipts, settling debts, and telling a disappointing business partner exactly how they felt about being cheated. Civilization, it turns out, was never only built on monumental achievements. It was also built, one clay tablet at a time, on ordinary people simply refusing to let a bad transaction go unrecorded. And speaking of ordinary daily frustrations being preserved forever in clay, nowhere does that come through more vividly, or with more genuine warmth once you look past the strict discipline involved, than in the actual schoolrooms where young Sumerian scribes were trained. Because we don't just know that Sumerian education existed. We have the students' own words, complaining about their teachers, worrying about their grades, and occasionally, quite touchingly, describing exactly what it felt like to sit in a classroom 4,000 years before anyone had a word for homework. Sumerian schools, the world's first classrooms. Every invention we've discussed so far, writing, mathematics, law, trade, needed one more thing to survive across generations: trained people capable of reading, writing, and applying all of it competently. And so, alongside inventing writing itself, the Sumerians also invented something we'd instantly recognize today, however different the specific methods: formal schools, dedicated specifically to producing literate, mathematically capable professionals. These schools were called eduba in Sumerian, a term that translates roughly to tablet house, and they existed primarily to train scribes, the professional class of literate specialists whose skills were needed by temples, palaces, and merchants across every Sumerian city. Becoming a scribe was not a quick or casual undertaking. Based on the enormous volume of surviving practice tablets, student exercises, and educational texts, we know that scribal training took years of sustained, repetitive, often grueling study, likely beginning in early to mid-childhood and continuing well into adolescence. Students began with the absolute fundamentals, learning to hold a reed stylus correctly and press basic wedge shapes into wet clay, copying out simple signs over and over until the motions became automatic. From there, they progressed to memorizing enormous lists of cuneiform signs, vocabulary lists organized by category, professions, animals, plants, geographic names, all copied and recopied repeatedly until a student could recognize and reproduce them from memory. Mathematics was taught alongside writing, since a scribe's daily professional work would very often involve calculating quantities of grain, land area, or trade values, all using that sexagesimal number system we discussed earlier. Discipline in these schools was notably strict, and we know this not from later commentary or speculation, but directly from the words of actual former students, preserved on surviving tablets. One especially well-known text, sometimes translated under a title along the lines of a schoolboy's day, walks through a student's experience from the moment he wakes up in the morning. He hurries to school, worried about being late, and once he arrives, the litany of punishments begins. He's struck for arriving late. He's struck for standing when he should have been seated. He's struck for talking without permission. He's struck for poor handwriting. The specific instrument of punishment described appears to have been some kind of cane or switch, and reading through the list, the tone strikes a strange, almost comedic balance between genuine hardship and something close to universal, timeless schoolboy grumbling, the kind of exaggerated litany of complaints that could plausibly come from a frustrated student in nearly any century. There's an equally fascinating text describing what modern translators sometimes summarize as the world's oldest documented case of a parent trying to get their child ahead through less than entirely academic means. According to this account, a father, apparently eager to ensure his son received favorable treatment and praise from his teacher, invited the schoolmaster to a dinner at his home, complete with food, drink, and gifts. The clear implication, according to scholars who have studied this text, is that the father was essentially engaging in what amounts to an ancient version of buttering up a teacher, hoping that generous hospitality and gifts would translate into his son being singled out for praise in front of his classmates. If this interpretation holds, and most Sumerologists studying the text believe it does, it means that the practice of parents trying to informally influence their children's academic standing through gifts to educators is not a modern phenomenon at all, but something that was already recognizable and apparently common enough to be worth writing a story about nearly 4,000 years ago. Scribal schools also produced something remarkably close to what we today call textbooks and reference works. There were extensive lexical lists, essentially early dictionaries organizing vocabulary by category, and mathematical tables listing multiplication results, reciprocals, and other calculations that students would need to memorize or reference repeatedly throughout their careers. Some of these lists were maintained and copied with such consistency across different cities and even across different centuries that scholars studying them today can trace a direct, continuous educational tradition stretching back through the Babylonian period all the way to its Sumerian origins. Why did any of this matter so much that an entire formal educational system had to be built around it? Because every other invention on this list depended entirely on a continuous supply of literate, numerate professionals capable of actually operating it. Law codes are meaningless without scribes capable of recording court proceedings and copying legal texts accurately. Trade networks collapse without merchants and administrators capable of tracking contracts, debts, and shipments. Irrigation systems require careful record-keeping of labor assignments and water allocation. Every single achievement we've walked through in this video, the wheel accepted perhaps, depended directly on this quiet, disciplined, often harsh system of scribal education, churning out generation after generation of literate professionals in classrooms that, based on the students' own surviving complaints, were exhausting, occasionally brutal, and apparently every bit as capable of producing a bored, resentful 10-year-old as any classroom operating today. And once you have professionals capable of reading, writing, and calculating at this level, it's a natural next step for some of them to turn their attention toward observing and recording the movements of the sky itself, tracking days, months, and years with genuine mathematical precision. Which brings us to a Sumerian achievement that quietly underlies something you almost certainly checked at least once today without thinking twice about it: the calendar hanging on your wall or glowing on your phone screen. The calendar and the stars, measuring time itself. There's a particular kind of vulnerability that comes with living entirely at the mercy of the seasons without any reliable way to predict them. When should the fields be flooded for planting? When should the harvest teams be organized? When is the right moment to expect the rivers to rise? For the earlier Sumerian farmers, these questions carried the weight of survival itself, and the answer they eventually settled on, watching and measuring the sky with obsessive, disciplined patience, gave the world its first genuinely functional calendar. The Sumerian calendar was built around the moon, and this makes intuitive sense once you think about it practically. The moon is the most visually obvious, reliably repeating pattern in the entire night sky, cycling through its full sequence of phases roughly every 29.5 days. Sumerian astronomers, likely priests attached to specific temples dedicated to tracking these celestial cycles, defined the beginning of each new month by the actual physical sighting of the thinnest visible crescent of the new moon, appearing low on the western horizon shortly after sunset. This wasn't a calculated, predicted date. Someone had to actually watch the sky, night after night, and formally declare that the new month had begun the moment that first sliver of light became visible. 12 of these lunar months, strung together, gave the Sumerians their basic yearly cycle. But here's the problem, and it's a problem every lunar calendar in human history has had to wrestle with in some form. 12 lunar months add up to roughly 354 days, while the actual solar year, the time it takes the Earth to complete its orbit and bring the seasons back around to where they started, runs closer to 365 days. That gap, roughly 11 days every single year, might not sound catastrophic, but left uncorrected, it accumulates with brutal consistency. Within just a handful of years, a purely lunar calendar drifts so far out of alignment with the actual seasons that a month originally associated with harvest season would eventually fall in the dead of winter instead. The Sumerians solved this the same way many later civilizations would independently arrive at solving it, by periodically inserting an extra 13th month into the calendar, a process scholars call intercalation, to nudge the lunar calendar back into rough alignment with the solar year. In the earliest periods, this was handled somewhat inconsistently, with individual Sumerian city-states each making their own independent decisions about exactly when an extra month was needed, leading to noticeable discrepancies between different cities' calendars. It wasn't until later, empires, first Babylonian and eventually Persian, brought this practice under more centralized, standardized control that intercalation became a predictable, systematic process rather than something declared somewhat haphazardly, city by city. Alongside this lunar calendar, Sumerian scribes also developed and maintained a separate, purely administrative calendar based on a fixed schematic year of exactly 360 days, divided evenly into 12 months of 30 days each. This wasn't meant to track the actual phases of the moon precisely. It was a clean, mathematically convenient bookkeeping tool, ideal for calculating things like interest on loans, wages owed over a fixed period, or rations to be distributed across a set number of days, without having to constantly account for the irregular, unpredictable lengths of real lunar months. It's a genuinely clever piece of practical engineering. Rather than forcing the real, messy, unpredictable sky to conform to convenient round numbers, Sumerian administrators simply maintained two separate parallel systems, one for religious and agricultural purposes tied to the actual observed moon, and one purely for administrative convenience. Beyond simply tracking months and years, Sumerian astronomers, and their Babylonian successors, who inherited and expanded this tradition, engaged in genuinely sustained, careful observation of the night sky. They identified and catalogued the brightest stars visible to the naked eye. They tracked the 5 planets observable without a telescope: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, noting their movements against the fixed background of stars with enough consistency that they could begin predicting future positions. They organized prominent stars into groupings we'd recognize today as constellations, and identified a specific band of constellations that the Sun, Moon, and visible planets all appeared to travel through over the course of a year, a concept that would eventually evolve, through later Babylonian refinement, into the 12 constellations of the zodiac still referenced in astrology today. It's worth being precise here about what this early Sumerian skywatching actually was and wasn't. This was not yet the mathematically sophisticated, remarkably accurate predictive astronomy that later Babylonian astronomers would develop over subsequent centuries, capable of forecasting eclipses and planetary positions with genuine mathematical rigor. Sumerian astronomy was, by comparison, considerably more observational and religiously oriented, closely tied to what's often described as omen interpretation, the belief that unusual events in the sky, an eclipse, an unexpected planetary alignment, carried meaning and warning for events happening on Earth, particularly concerning the fate of kings, cities, and battles. This wasn't personal fortune-telling in the sense many people associate with astrology today. Surviving evidence suggests Sumerian celestial divination was concerned primarily with matters of state, whether a military campaign would succeed, whether a city's harvest would be favourable, rather than with predicting the personal fate of any single individual. Regardless of the religious motivations behind it, the disciplined, sustained habit of observing, recording, and organising celestial movements laid essential groundwork for everything that followed. The Babylonians, inheriting this tradition directly from Sumerian precedent, would go on to develop remarkably precise mathematical models capable of predicting lunar eclipses and planetary movements centuries in advance. Models so mathematically sound that later Greek astronomers, including figures whose names most people have actually heard of, borrowed Babylonian data and methods directly for their own astronomical work. And here's where we come full circle back to something we touched on earlier in this video, that sexagesimal number system built around the number 60. The reason your clock divides an hour into 60 minutes and each minute into 60 seconds traces back through this exact tradition, Sumerian mathematics applied to Sumerian astronomical observation, refined by Babylonian scholars, and eventually passed onward through Greek astronomy into the broader framework of timekeeping that spread over the following centuries across nearly the entire world. Every time you glance at a clock today, you are, in a very real and direct sense, reading a number system invented by anonymous priests and scribes standing on a rooftop in Mesopotamia, watching the moon rise roughly 5,000 years ago. There's something genuinely moving about this if you let yourself sit with it for a moment. Long before anyone had any scientific understanding of what stars actually are, before anyone knew the Earth orbits the Sun rather than the reverse, people were already disciplined enough, patient enough, and curious enough to track these lights across the sky with enough consistency and mathematical rigour to build a working calendar around them, a calendar accurate enough to organise farming, taxation, religious festivals, and government administration across multiple competing city-states for well over 2,000 years. Of course, all of this skywatching, all of this careful mathematics and administration still had to happen inside living, breathing human bodies, bodies that got sick, got injured, and eventually needed care and treatment. And it turns out the Sumerians approached the human body with the exact same disciplined, methodical curiosity they applied to the night sky, leaving behind what many scholars consider the world's oldest known medical text, a genuinely fascinating window into the very first attempts at organised written medicine. The world's oldest medical text. Sometime toward the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, in the city of Nippur, an anonymous Sumerian healer sat down and did something that had apparently never been done before in quite this way. Rather than simply relying on memory, apprenticeship, and oral tradition to pass along medical knowledge, this person, whose name has been lost entirely to time, pressed a series of detailed medical prescriptions into a single clay tablet, creating what many scholars consider to be the oldest known medical handbook in human history. This tablet, sometimes nicknamed by more casual writers as something like the Nippur Old Drugstore, contains around 15 distinct prescriptions, each one a carefully structured recipe combining specific ingredients, precise preparation methods, and instructions for how the resulting remedy should be applied. What's genuinely remarkable, reading through modern translations of this text, is how methodical and almost clinical it feels, especially compared to what you might expect from medicine this ancient. There's very little mention of magic, incantation, or divine intervention in this particular tablet, which stands in noticeable contrast to some other surviving Mesopotamian medical texts from later periods that blend herbal treatment with ritual and prayer far more explicitly. This earlier Sumerian document reads, instead, like a working pharmacist's personal notebook, a practical, results-oriented collection of remedies clearly built up through real, sustained trial and observation. The range of ingredients listed is genuinely striking. Scholars working to translate this tablet, particularly a team at the University of Pennsylvania who made significant progress deciphering it, identified substances including willow bark, a plant whose bark contains compounds chemically related to modern aspirin and has been used to relieve pain and fever across many different cultures throughout history. They also identified what appears to be an early reference to a substance related to cannabis, along with mineral ingredients like salt and saltpeter, and plant-based ingredients including myrtle, thyme, and a resin called asafoetida, still used today in certain traditional cooking and medicine. Many of these dry ingredients, according to the prescriptions, were meant to be ground into a powder and then dissolved into a liquid base, commonly wine or beer, apparently serving as a practical solvent to help deliver the active medicinal ingredients into the body. Other surviving Mesopotamian medical tablets, some from slightly later periods but clearly drawing on this same continuous tradition, describe an even wider and occasionally startling range of remedies. Alongside more recognizable ingredients like fig, mustard, and myrrh, some prescriptions call for substances that would raise eyebrows in any modern pharmacy, including turtle shell powder, snakeskin, river silt, and, in one particularly memorable case, a specific reference to hair taken from the stomach of a cow. Modern medical historians studying these texts generally approach ingredients like this with appropriate caution, noting that we cannot always be certain of the precise translation or the actual intended substance behind every ancient term, and that some ingredients likely carried symbolic or ritual significance rather than being chosen purely for a chemically active property. But it's clear that Sumerian and early Mesopotamian medicine drew on an enormously broad natural pharmacy, plant, animal, and mineral alike, assembled through generations of accumulated practical experience. Some of the specific remedies that have been translated feel almost startlingly relatable once you strip away the archaic ingredients and picture the actual human discomfort being addressed. One surviving prescription addresses a persistent, aching tooth, recommending that the fruit of a specific plant be placed directly against the aching tooth for relief, essentially an ancient version of applying a topical remedy directly to a source of pain, not far removed conceptually from someone today dabbing clove oil onto a sore tooth before they can get to a dentist. Other tablets describe treatments for skin conditions, internal ailments, and general poultices, salves, and washes meant to be applied externally to wounds or irritated skin. There's also textual evidence that Mesopotamian healers understood and used salt water as a gargle, likely for sore throats or oral discomfort, used sour wine in ways that suggest an intuitive, if not chemically explained, understanding of its disinfectant properties, and used compounds derived from urine, specifically potassium nitrate, as an astringent, a substance that causes tissue to contract and can help control minor bleeding or reduce irritation. It's worth being honest about the limits of what we can claim here. We don't always know exactly what specific plant or substance corresponds to every ancient Sumerian or Akkadian term used in these prescriptions, since plant names shift, get lost, or get applied to different species over centuries, and translators are sometimes left making educated, careful guesses based on context and later Mesopotamian pharmacological traditions that built on this earlier foundation. And it would be a mistake to imagine ancient Sumerian medicine as some kind of secretly advanced, fully scientific medical system indistinguishable from anything modern. Some remedies almost certainly worked, at least partially, through genuine identifiable chemical properties, willow bark's pain-relieving compounds being perhaps the clearest example. Others likely provided psychological comfort, placebo effect, or simply reflected the honest, earnest best guesses of healers working entirely without any concept of germs, cellular biology, or the actual underlying causes of most diseases they were trying to treat. But taken as a whole, This tablet and the broader medical tradition it represents tell us something genuinely important about how methodically the Sumerians approached even something as intimate and urgent as illness and pain. This wasn't guesswork passed along purely through whispered oral tradition, vulnerable to being distorted, forgotten, or lost every time an experienced healer died without training a successor. This was knowledge deliberately captured in a fixed, durable, shareable written format, meant to be read, referenced, and presumably improved upon by future practitioners. Medicine in Sumer had already become a formal profession worth documenting properly, worth teaching from a written reference rather than memory alone, thousands of years before anyone had a concept of peer-reviewed medical literature. Later Mesopotamian civilizations built substantially on this Sumerian foundation. Surviving records suggest ancient Mesopotamian societies eventually recognized at least two broadly distinct categories of healing practitioner, one focused more heavily on herbal and physical remedies, and another whose practice blended medicine more explicitly with religious ritual and incantation, treating illness as something that could have both physical and supernatural causes, requiring both physical and ritual treatment. This dual approach, part practical pharmacology, part religious ritual, would remain a persistent feature of Mesopotamian medicine for well over 2,000 years following this earliest Sumerian tablet, eventually contributing an enormous body of surviving medical literature, with scholars estimating roughly 1,000 surviving cuneiform medical tablets overall, including a substantial collection preserved within the famous library assembled centuries later by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal. There's something quietly moving about picturing this specific anonymous Sumerian healer, working in Nippur, patiently pressing these 15 prescriptions into wet clay, entirely unaware that this small, practical, unglamorous professional notebook would outlast their entire civilization, would outlast the language they wrote it in, would outlast literally everyone who ever read it during their own lifetime, and would eventually be excavated, translated, and studied by scholars working in laboratories and universities. The original healer could never have imagined existing, roughly 4,000 years after the clay was first pressed into shape. And speaking of daily comforts the Sumerians took seriously enough to document carefully, we cannot talk about Sumerian medicine and daily life without addressing something that might be, depending on your personal priorities, one of the single most beloved Sumerian inventions of all: beer. Because the Sumerians didn't just drink beer casually, they wrote hymns about it, they may have brewed it before they even perfected bread, and the story of how thoroughly beer was woven into daily Sumerian life is genuinely one of the more surprising and delightful threads running through this entire civilization. Beer, the drink that may have come before bread. Here's a claim that sounds like it belongs in a bar conversation rather than a serious historical discussion, and yet it comes directly from genuine archaeological research. Some scholars studying the domestication of barley across the ancient Fertile Crescent have seriously argued that an early ancestor of beer may have existed before bread did, meaning that one of humanity's very first uses for cultivated grain might have been brewing rather than baking. Whether or not that specific claim holds up to every detail of scrutiny, what's absolutely certain is that beer was central to Sumerian daily life in a way that's honestly difficult for a modern person to fully appreciate. Archaeological evidence for brewing in the broader Mesopotamian region stretches back to around 3,500 BCE, or possibly earlier, with researchers identifying actual chemical residue consistent with beer preserved inside a fragment of ancient pottery recovered from Godin Tepe, a Sumerian trading settlement located in what is today western Iran. And a separate, genuinely charming piece of physical evidence comes from a clay tablet found in Uruk, dated to roughly 3,300 BCE, depicting a simple image of a human head positioned beside a bowl and a distinctive conical drinking vessel, generally interpreted by scholars as an early symbolic representation of a worker's daily food and beer ration. Beer in Sumer was not a luxury indulgence reserved for special occasions or wealthy elites. It was, quite literally, a dietary staple, distributed as a standard part of daily wages and rations to labourers working on temple and palace projects. In a region where water quality could often be genuinely uncertain or risky to drink directly, the brewing process itself, involving boiling and fermentation, likely made beer a considerably safer source of daily hydration than untreated river or well water, alongside providing meaningful caloric and nutritional value from the grain used to make it. Beer wasn't simply something Sumerians enjoyed. In a very real, practical sense, it helped keep the workforce that built their canals, temples, and city walls fed, hydrated, and functioning. The scale of this cannot be overstated. Temple administrations maintained careful, detailed records tracking beer rations issued to workers, and surviving ration tablets specifically document daily allotments handed out as part of standard compensation. According to later textual evidence, by the time of the Babylonians, who inherited and expanded on Sumerian brewing traditions, there were reportedly over 70 distinct recorded varieties of beer being produced, and it's likely there were additional varieties that either went unrecorded or simply haven't been recovered by archaeologists yet. A well-known Sumerian proverb, preserved through this brewing tradition, states plainly that a person who does not know beer does not know what is good, a line that tells you everything you need to know about how deeply beer was woven into how the Sumerians understood pleasure, comfort, and the good life itself. Beer was so central to Sumerian culture, in fact, that it had its own dedicated goddess, Ninkasi, whose name translates roughly to something like the lady who fills the mouth. According to Sumerian mythology, Ninkasi's origin is tied to a healing episode involving the great god Enki and the mother goddess Ninhursag, linking beer symbolically to themes of healing, renewal, and restoration rather than simple recreational indulgence. And remarkably, we don't just know that Ninkasi existed as a religious figure. We have an entire surviving hymn dedicated specifically to her, written down around 1800 BCE, though scholars are confident the actual brewing techniques and traditions it describes are considerably older, likely reflecting methods already in continuous use for centuries or more before the hymn itself was formally recorded in writing. This text, generally referred to today as the Hymn to Ninkasi, functions simultaneously as a religious song of praise and, remarkably, as something close to an actual, step-by-step brewing recipe. It describes preparing malted grain, spreading cooked mash out on large reed mats to cool, mixing the resulting sweet liquid, called sweetwort, with honey and additional ingredients, and finally straining and pouring the finished fermented beer from a large collecting vessel. One particularly evocative line describes the sound and abundance of the beer being poured from this collector vat as resembling the powerful onrush of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers themselves, a genuinely beautiful piece of poetic imagery for something as ordinary as pouring a drink. Scholars generally believe this hymn was likely sung aloud by brewers, quite possibly women, since evidence suggests that professional Sumerian brewing was frequently associated with female practitioners and priestesses connected to Ninkasi's temple cult, chanting or singing the hymn as a kind of working song while they moved through the actual physical steps of the brewing process itself, passed down from master brewers to their apprentices as both religious devotion and practical instruction rolled into a single memorized song. It's worth pointing out, too, that Sumerian literature doesn't treat beer itself as something dangerous or morally suspect. Some surviving texts do address the personal failings that can come from excessive drunkenness, treating overindulgence as a very human weakness worth acknowledging. But the beverage itself is consistently treated as a genuine divine gift, something that brings joy, comfort, and social connection when enjoyed with appropriate moderation and respect for its strength, rather than something inherently corrupting or shameful. And this makes complete sense once you understand just how socially central beer actually was. It wasn't simply consumed alone at the end of a hard work day. Sumerian cities had dedicated establishments, essentially early taverns, where people gathered specifically to drink, socialize, and conduct business together. These establishments were significant enough to Sumerian civic life that they were directly addressed within formal legal codes from this broader region, with specific regulations covering things like fair pricing and honest measurement of the beer being served, evidence that Sumerian authorities took beer quality and tavern conduct seriously enough to legislate around it directly, protecting ordinary customers from being cheated by dishonest tavern keepers, in much the same spirit that later laws would protect merchants and buyers in other kinds of transactions we've already discussed. So the next time you crack open a beer, however casually, you're participating in a tradition that stretches back in an unbroken line of technique and cultural significance, roughly 6,000 years, to farmers and brewers working the fields and breweries of ancient Sumer, who took the process seriously enough to give it a goddess, a hymn, legal protections, and a permanent, honoured place in daily life, whether you were a labourer hauling mud brick for a temple wall or a king celebrating a military victory. And speaking of how the Sumerians spent their leisure time when they weren't working, farming, or drinking, it turns out they also invented something else you've almost certainly encountered in some modern form without ever realising its ancient origin. One of the very first board games in recorded human history, complete with dice, strategy, and, we can only assume, plenty of arguments over the rules. The Royal Game of the world's first board game. Sometime between roughly 2600 and 2400 BCE, in the city of someone crafted a small, beautifully decorated game board, inlaid with shell, red limestone, and lapis lazuli in intricate geometric patterns, designed for two players to compete against each other using dice and a set of small playing pieces. This object, discovered by the archaeologist Leonard Woolley during his excavations of the royal tombs of in the 1920s, has become known today as the Royal Game of and it stands as one of the oldest board games we have direct physical evidence of anywhere in the ancient world. The board itself is distinctive in shape, consisting of two rectangular sections of squares connected by a narrow bridge of just two additional squares, giving the whole board an unusual, almost dumbbell-like silhouette, rather than the simple uniform grid you might expect from a modern board game. In total, the board contains 20 squares, which is why the game is sometimes alternatively called the Game of 20 Squares in academic literature. Excavators recovered complete sets, including 7 playing pieces for each of the two competing players, one set coloured white and the other black, along with a group of small 4-sided dice shaped like tetrahedrons that were rolled to determine how many spaces a player's piece could move. Unfortunately, and this is a genuinely frustrating gap for anyone who'd love to actually sit down and play this game exactly as the Sumerians did, the original written rules explaining precisely how the game was played have not survived from this earliest period. We know the equipment. We know roughly how many pieces each player had. We don't have a rule book. What we do have, remarkably, is a much later cuneiform tablet dating to around 177 BCE, more than 2,000 years after the game itself was first created, in which a Babylonian scribe recorded a set of rules for playing this exact game, evidence that the Royal Game of remained popular and continued to be played in some form for an almost unbelievably long stretch of ancient history. Based on this later evidence, along with comparisons to structurally similar games from other ancient cultures, most notably the ancient Egyptian game called Senet, historians and game researchers generally believe the royal game of functioned as a race game, where the two players competed to move all of their pieces along the board's path and off the far end before their opponent could do the same, with the dice rolls determining movement and certain specific squares on the board offering special advantages, protections, or opportunities to bump an opponent's pieces backward. Some researchers have drawn direct comparisons between this ancient Sumerian game and the modern game of backgammon, suggesting the royal game of may represent a genuine ancestor, or at minimum a very close structural relative, of a board game still played by millions of people today. What's particularly striking about this game's staying power is just how far it travelled and how long it lasted. Physical and textual evidence suggests some version of this game, or very closely related variants, spread and remained popular across a huge stretch of the ancient Near East for well over 1,000 years after its creation in It's a small, almost whimsical detail in the grand sweep of Sumerian achievement, farming, writing, law, and mathematics, but it matters because it reminds us that the Sumerians weren't only inventing tools for survival and administration. They were also inventing tools for pure entertainment, competition, and connection between friends and family, exactly the same basic human impulse that keeps board game nights alive in living rooms all over the world today. Of course, none of these games, none of this elaborate daily life, farming, brewing, and record-keeping would have been possible without one final foundational category of invention we haven't fully addressed yet: the actual physical tools and materials the Sumerians used to build, cut, farm, and fight. And that story takes us directly into fire, ore, and one of the most consequential material breakthroughs in the entire ancient world: the transition from soft, workable copper into something dramatically stronger, harder, and more useful: bronze. Metallurgy, from copper to bronze, and the weapons that changed warfare. We've already mentioned several times throughout this video that southern Mesopotamia had essentially no natural metal deposits of its own, forcing the Sumerians to build an entire maritime trade network across the Persian Gulf just to secure a reliable supply of copper. Now it's time to look directly at what the Sumerians actually did with that hard-won copper once they had it, because the story of Sumerian metalworking is really the story of a centuries-long chemistry experiment conducted entirely through patient trial and error that eventually gave the ancient world one of its most consequential material breakthroughs. The Sumerians were extracting and working copper from a remarkably early period, with evidence for copper use in the broader Mesopotamian region, stretching back potentially 5,000 to 6,000 years before the present. Extracting usable copper from raw ore is not a simple task. It requires smelting, a process of heating ore to extremely high temperatures inside a furnace to chemically separate the pure metal from the surrounding rock and mineral impurities it's naturally bound up with. Sumerian metalworkers built dedicated furnaces for exactly this purpose, and once they had usable molten copper, they could cast it into molds to create tools, weapons, and decorative objects, ranging from practical items like axes, chisels, and arrowheads to more refined pieces, including vessels, jewellery, and ceremonial objects. Pure copper, however, has a real limitation. It's a relatively soft metal, meaning tools and weapons made from it dull quickly, bend under stress, and simply don't hold an edge nearly as well as harder materials would. For several centuries, Sumerian metalworkers appear to have worked around this limitation somewhat accidentally, using a naturally occurring form of copper that already contained a certain amount of arsenic mixed in from the original ore itself. This arsenical copper, as it's generally called by researchers, was noticeably harder and more durable than pure copper, but it came with a serious hidden cost. Smelting arsenic-bearing copper releases toxic arsenic fumes, and ancient metalworkers, breathing these fumes repeatedly over years of work in poorly ventilated furnace conditions, were almost certainly suffering slow, cumulative poisoning as an occupational hazard of their craft, entirely without understanding why. The real breakthrough, and the one significant enough to give an entire era of human history its name, came when Sumerian metalworkers discovered that deliberately alloying copper with a specific measured amount of a different metal entirely, tin, produced a dramatically superior material. This alloy, true tin bronze, is generally understood to have emerged sometime around 3000 BCE, though the exact circumstances of exactly how ancient smiths first arrived at this specific combination remain genuinely mysterious to modern researchers. Nobody left behind a written account explaining the actual moment of discovery, and scholars studying this transition still openly describe it as one of the more puzzling, unsolved questions in the history of ancient technology. What we do know, based on both surviving cuneiform texts describing metalworking techniques and modern chemical analysis of actual recovered bronze artifacts, is that Sumerian metalsmiths eventually settled, through what appears to have been sustained, deliberate experimentation, on a fairly consistent recipe, roughly 10% tin mixed with 90% copper. This specific ratio wasn't arbitrary. Researchers studying the chemistry involved believe this proportion represented a carefully balanced compromise between achieving the genuinely superior physical properties that tin bronze offers, greater hardness, a better ability to hold a sharp edge, and easier, cleaner casting into detailed molds, against the practical reality that tin itself was an even scarcer, more difficult to acquire resource than copper already was in resource. Poor Mesopotamia. And this scarcity of tin is genuinely one of the great logistical puzzles of the ancient Bronze Age. Unlike copper, for which Sumerian traders had already established relatively direct routes to sources like Magan and other regional suppliers, workable sources of tin appear to have been considerably more distant and difficult to access from Mesopotamia, requiring trade connections stretching even further afield than the copper routes we discussed earlier. This scarcity meant that despite bronze's clearly superior performance compared to plain copper or even arsenical copper, it took a genuinely long time, well over 1,000 years by some estimates, for tin bronze to fully displace the older, cheaper, more readily available arsenical copper across the wider region, precisely because reliable, affordable tin supply chains took that long to fully mature and stabilize. Physical evidence for just how thoroughly bronze eventually took hold comes directly from the royal tombs of Ur, the same spectacular burial site that gave us the Standard of Ur and the royal game of Ur. Among the metal vessels recovered from these tombs, the overwhelming majority, roughly 3/4 by some accounts, were found to be made specifically from tin bronze rather than plain copper or the older arsenical copper alloy, strong physical confirmation that by this period, tin bronze had firmly established itself as the dominant, preferred metal for high-status objects among Sumerian society's wealthiest and most powerful members. The consequences of this shift rippled through nearly every aspect of Sumerian material life. Bronze tools, being significantly harder and more durable than plain copper, made agricultural work, woodworking, and construction meaningfully more efficient. Bronze weapons, axes, spearheads, and eventually swords and daggers gave Sumerian and later Akkadian armies a genuine, tangible military advantage over any rival populations still relying primarily on stone tools or weaker metal alloys. Combined with the wheeled battle wagons and eventually the swift spoked wheel chariots we discussed earlier in this video, bronze weaponry helped transform ancient Mesopotamian warfare from something resembling organized tribal raiding into genuinely sophisticated, disciplined military campaigns capable of conquering and holding territory across enormous distances, exactly the kind of military capability that would eventually allow conquerors like Sargon of Akkad to forge the very first true multi-ethnic empire in human history, built directly on top of the Sumerian city-states and their accumulated technological inheritance. It's worth pausing to appreciate the sheer, patient persistence this metallurgical achievement actually required. There was no textbook, no periodic table, no scientific understanding of atomic structure or alloys to guide Sumerian metalworkers toward this discovery. There was only generation after generation of skilled craftsmen working directly with fire, ore, and raw material, carefully observing and remembering which specific combinations produced better, stronger, more useful results, slowly refining their methods through pure empirical trial and error until they arrived at a 10% tin ratio that, remarkably, modern metallurgical analysis confirms really was close to an optimal practical balance for the tools available to them. This is craftsmanship elevated to genuine applied science, even though nobody involved would have used or understood that particular term. We've now covered an enormous amount of ground together: writing, the wheel, mathematics, cylinder seals, irrigation and the plough, sailboats and long-distance trade, the city itself, written law, the world's oldest courtroom drama, consumer complaints, schools, the calendar, and astronomy, medicine, beer, board games, and now metallurgy and bronze. And in a very real sense, every single one of these inventions fed directly into and depended on the others, writing enabling law and administration, agriculture and irrigation enabling cities, trade enabling metallurgy, mathematics enabling astronomy and the calendar. But there's one more enormous piece of the Sumerian world we haven't fully addressed yet: the belief system, the religion, and the towering physical monuments the Sumerians built specifically to house and honor their gods. And that story brings us to the single most recognizable physical structure to survive from ancient Sumer, the ziggurat. The ziggurat, building a mountain for the gods. If you've ever seen a single image representing ancient Mesopotamia, there's a genuinely good chance it was a photograph or illustration of a ziggurat, one of those massive, stepped pyramid-like structures rising in stark, terraced layers out of the flat desert landscape of southern Iraq. And unlike many of the inventions we've discussed today, which required careful explanation to appreciate their significance, the ziggurat announces its importance immediately, just through sheer scale and visual presence. The origins of ziggurat architecture stretch back further than you might expect, with some form of raised temple platform tradition potentially extending back to the Ubaid period, before Sumerian civilization had even fully taken the shape we've been discussing throughout this video, possibly as early as the 6th millennium BCE. Some scholars have speculated, based partly on the actual Sumerian and Akkadian words used for these structures, which translate roughly to peak, pinnacle, or high place, that this architectural tradition may reflect cultural memory of sacred mountains from an earlier period before Sumerian communities settled permanently onto the flat river plains of Mesopotamia, deliberately recreating a mountain's shape and height in a landscape that otherwise offered nothing remotely resembling one. By the Uruk period, roughly 4000 to 3100 BCE, ziggurats, or at minimum their early architectural predecessors, were already being constructed in Sumerian cities, each one dedicated to that particular city's own patron deity. The White Temple and its accompanying platform structure at Uruk, dedicated to the great sky god Anu, is generally considered among the earliest true ziggurats, with some elements of the underlying platform potentially dating back toward 4000 BCE, and the temple structure itself commonly dated to around 3500 BCE, representing an almost unbelievably early example of monumental religious architecture. The most famous and best preserved ziggurat surviving today, and likely the specific structure most people picture when they hear the word at all, is the Great Ziggurat of Ur. Built under the authority of King Ur-Nammu, the very same ruler responsible for that pioneering written law code we spent so much time discussing earlier in this video. Construction began under Ur-Nammu himself and was completed by his son and successor, Shulgi, sometime during the 21st century BCE. Its Sumerian name, Etemeniguru, translates to something along the lines of the house whose foundation creates terror, a genuinely striking, almost intimidating name for a building, and one that gives you some sense of just how overwhelming this structure was likely meant to feel to ordinary Sumerians standing at its base. The physical dimensions of this ziggurat are staggering for a structure built entirely from mud brick roughly 4,000 years ago. Based on surviving foundations, the structure measured approximately 64 meters in length, 45 meters in width, and would have originally risen to a height, by most scholarly estimates, of around 30 meters, though since only the base and foundation levels have survived intact, the exact original height remains somewhat speculative. It was constructed using a solid core of simple mud brick, essentially unbaked clay bricks dried in the sun, with an outer protective facing of more durable, kiln-fired baked bricks, the two layers bonded together using bitumen, that same natural tar-like substance we mentioned earlier being used as glue for the standard of Ur's decorative inlay. This construction technique, a cheap, abundant core material protected by a tougher, weather-resistant outer shell, reflects exactly the kind of practical resourcefulness you'd expect from a civilization working with almost no natural stone of its own, forced to build monumental architecture using nothing but river mud, fire, and remarkably disciplined labor organization. It's crucial to understand what a ziggurat actually was, and perhaps more importantly, what it was not, because there's a common modern misconception worth directly addressing. A ziggurat was never intended as a public gathering space or a house of worship, in the way we might picture a modern church, synagogue, or mosque, somewhere ordinary people would regularly enter to pray communally. Quite the opposite. The ziggurat itself, and particularly the small shrine or temple room believed to sit at its very summit, was understood by the Sumerians as the literal physical dwelling place of that city's patron god, a home built for a divine resident rather than a gathering hall for human worshippers. Ordinary citizens were generally not permitted to climb the ziggurat or enter these sacred spaces directly at all. Only priests and other individuals of especially high religious standing were allowed access to the upper levels and the shrine itself, and it was specifically their responsibility, as a formal, ongoing religious duty, to care for and effectively serve the god believed to reside there, providing offerings of food, drink, music, and ritual attention, much the way household servants might tend to the needs of an especially important resident. This detail tells you something genuinely important about how Sumerian religion actually functioned in daily practice, as opposed to how modern religious observance often works. Worship, for most ordinary Sumerians, likely happened primarily through participation in public festivals, processions, and ritual events organized around agricultural cycles and significant mythological stories, rather than through direct personal, individual access to the god's actual dwelling place. The relationship between humanity and the divine, at least as institutionally practiced, ran primarily through the specialized, dedicated, intermediary class of priests and priestesses, who alone bore responsibility for maintaining that direct connection on behalf of the wider community. The Sumerian religious worldview populating these temples was built around an enormous, richly developed pantheon of gods and goddesses, with specific deities governing different aspects of the natural and social world. An, sometimes rendered Anu, presided as the great sky god. Enlil governed air, wind, and by extension, kingship and the fate of nations, ruling from his primary temple at the city of Nippur, which functioned as something like the spiritual and religious capital of the entire Sumerian world, even though it rarely held direct political power itself. Enki, whose primary cult center was at Eridu, one of the very oldest Sumerian cities, governed water, wisdom, and craftsmanship. Nana, whom we already met earlier in this video as the deity honored by the great ziggurat of Ur, governed the moon. And Inanna, one of the most vivid, complex, and enduringly fascinating figures in the entire Sumerian pantheon, governed love, fertility, and war simultaneously, a combination that captures something genuinely important about how the Sumerians understood passion, desire, and conflict as deeply intertwined forces rather than separate, unrelated domains of human experience. A particularly powerful subset of these deities, sometimes referred to collectively as the Anunnaki, a term whose meaning is generally understood as something like those descended from An, formed an especially significant divine assembly within Sumerian religious thought, associated with issuing fundamental divine decrees that governed fate, kingship, justice, and the basic order of the universe itself. It's worth directly and plainly addressing something here, since it comes up constantly in popular discussion of Sumerian mythology online. In recent decades, certain popular but firmly non-scholarly authors have promoted a theory suggesting these Anunnaki deities were actually ancient extraterrestrial visitors, and that ziggurats were secretly built as landing sites or spaceports for their supposed technology. This idea, however entertaining some people find it, is not supported by mainstream historians, archaeologists, or Assyriologists studying actual Sumerian texts and artifacts, and it isn't something we're going to spend more time on here beyond simply noting, clearly and directly, that it doesn't reflect legitimate scholarly understanding of the actual textual and archaeological evidence. The genuine, well-documented story, gods understood as powerful personifications of natural forces, fate, and cosmic order, worshipped through an elaborate, carefully maintained temple system, is remarkable enough entirely on its own terms, without requiring any speculative embellishment. What makes the ziggurat, and the broader religious system it physically embodied, such a fitting note to include this far into our exploration of Sumerian achievement, is how directly it connects back to nearly everything else we've discussed today. The temple complex surrounding each ziggurat wasn't simply a religious center. It typically functioned as a genuine administrative hub for the entire city, closely tied to exactly the kind of economic record-keeping, grain storage, and labor organization that originally drove the invention of writing itself all the way back at the very beginning of this video. The priests who maintained these temples were very often among the most highly trained scribes in Sumerian society, directly connecting the religious and bureaucratic functions of the city into a single unified institution. Religion, administration, mathematics, writing, and monumental engineering weren't separate, isolated Sumerian achievements happening independently of each other. They were all fundamentally interconnected expressions of the exact same underlying civilization, each one reinforcing and enabling the others. And that interconnection brings us finally to the point in this video where we need to step back and look at the complete picture. Because after walking through writing, the wheel, mathematics, cylinder seals, irrigation and the plough, sailboats, the city itself, written law, courtroom drama, consumer complaints, formal education, the calendar, medicine, beer, board games, bronze metallurgy, and monumental religious architecture, a genuinely important question deserves a real, honest answer. What actually happened to the people who built all of this? Why isn't Sumerian civilization something every single person learns about as thoroughly as they learn about Egypt, Greece, or Rome? And what precisely is left of Sumer today, buried under the dust of southern Iraq, waiting quietly for the rest of the world to remember exactly how much it truly owes them? Salt in the soil, how Sumer actually fell. Every civilization we know about eventually changes, weakens, or transforms into something else, and Sumer is no exception. But the specific way Sumerian civilization declined is genuinely worth understanding properly, because the popular image many people carry, some sudden dramatic collapse, a single catastrophic invasion wiping everything out overnight, doesn't really match what the historical and archaeological evidence actually shows. The real story is slower, sadder, and in its own way more human. A story of environmental strain, political fragmentation, and repeated invasion, unfolding gradually across many centuries. The first major disruption to purely independent Sumerian city-state rule came around 2350 to 2334 BCE, when a ruler named Sargon, coming from the region and culture known as Akkad, conquered the various competing Sumerian city-states one by one and unified them under a single centralized authority, creating what many historians consider the world's first true multi-ethnic empire. Sargon's rise didn't erase Sumerian culture. Quite the opposite, in fact. The Akkadians, who spoke a completely different Semitic language unrelated to Sumerian, enthusiastically adopted and preserved enormous amounts of Sumerian religious tradition, literature, mathematics, and administrative practice, including, of course, cuneiform writing itself, which the Akkadians adapted to write their own entirely different language. In many genuine important ways, the culture of Sumer didn't die with Sargon's conquest. It became the intellectual and religious operating system running underneath an entirely new political structure, in much the same way that later Roman civilization would absorb and preserve enormous amounts of Greek culture even after politically conquering Greek city-states. The Akkadian Empire itself, however, eventually weakened and collapsed, sometime after roughly 2200 BCE, worn down by a combination of internal instability and pressure from outside groups, particularly a people called the Gutians, who came down from the surrounding mountain regions and asserted dominance over significant portions of Mesopotamia for a period. Sumerian accounts from this era, admittedly written by people who had every reason to view Gutian rule unfavourably, describe this period in genuinely bleak terms, complaining that agricultural output collapsed and that basic trade and administration fell into disorder under Gutian control, though modern historians debate exactly how severe this decline actually was in practice. Eventually, Sumerian rulers reasserted independent control, culminating in the rise of the third dynasty of Ur, founded by none other than Ur-Nammu, the very same king responsible for that pioneering written law code we spent considerable time discussing earlier in this video. This period, often called the Ur-III period, or sometimes referred to by modern historians as a Sumerian Renaissance, represented a genuine, deliberate revival of Sumerian political power, religious tradition, and monumental building, including the construction of the great ziggurat of Ur itself. For a stretch of roughly a century, Sumerian civilization, under Ur-Nammu and his successors, including his son Shulgi, experienced a genuine resurgence of centralized authority, ambitious infrastructure projects, and renewed cultural production. But underneath this apparent resurgence, a slower, quieter, more insidious problem was steadily undermining the entire foundation Sumerian civilization had always depended on: the land itself. Remember that everything we discussed earlier about Sumerian irrigation involved constantly channeling river water onto farmland to nourish crops. Over many centuries of continuous intensive irrigation, this practice created an accumulating, largely invisible problem. Irrigation water, even when it looks perfectly clean, always carries small amounts of dissolved salt and mineral content. When that water evaporates off farmland under the intense heat of the Mesopotamian sun, as it inevitably does after each irrigation cycle, the salt it carried doesn't evaporate along with it. It stays behind, accumulating in the topsoil, cycle after cycle, year after year, century after century. This process, called soil salinization, is exactly the kind of slow, cumulative, environmental problem that's almost impossible to notice happening in any single human lifetime, but becomes catastrophic once it crosses a critical threshold. Archaeological and agricultural evidence suggests that by the period of the Akkadian and three dynasties, Sumerian farmers had already begun shifting their primary grain crop away from wheat, which is notably sensitive to soil salt content, toward barley, a considerably more salt-tolerant grain, a clear practical adaptation to soil conditions that were steadily, measurably deteriorating. But even this adaptation eventually proved insufficient. Historical estimates suggest that in the region between roughly 2100 and 1700 BCE, the population sustainable by this land declined dramatically, by as much as 3/5 according to some scholarly estimates, a genuinely staggering collapse in agricultural carrying capacity, driven directly by centuries of accumulated soil salinization, slowly poisoning the very farmland that had originally allowed Sumerian cities to grow so large in the first place. Layered on top of this slow environmental crisis came renewed external military pressure. Around 2004 BCE, invaders from Elam, a rival civilization based in the region of what is today southwestern Iran, launched a decisive military campaign against the weakened Ur-3 state. Sumerian texts describing this event, understandably coloured by the trauma of experiencing it, describe the invasion in almost apocalyptic, storm-like terms, as though the disaster were a deliberate, divinely ordained catastrophe rather than simply a military defeat. The Elamite forces sacked the city of Ur itself, damaged or destroyed significant portions of its infrastructure, and captured the last king of the Ur-3 dynasty, a ruler named Ibbi-Sin, bringing a definitive, humiliating end to independent Sumerian political power in this specific form. After this collapse, the region entered a new political era, increasingly dominated by Amorite rulers, a Semitic-speaking people who established new dynasties across Mesopotamia, eventually including the rise of Babylon itself as the region's dominant power under rulers like the famous Hammurabi, whose own law code, as we discussed earlier, drew heavily and directly on the earlier precedent Ur-Nammu had established centuries before. Throughout this transition, something genuinely poignant happened to the Sumerian language itself, as the ethnic and political balance of Mesopotamia shifted decisively toward Akkadian-speaking populations. Ordinary spoken Sumerian gradually faded out of daily use entirely, but it didn't disappear completely. Sumerian survived for many additional centuries, specifically as a formal literary, religious, and scholarly language, studied and used by trained scribes and priests in much the same specialized, prestigious role that Latin would later occupy in medieval Europe, long after ordinary people stopped speaking Latin as their native tongue. This detail matters enormously because it means Sumerian civilization didn't vanish in some sudden, complete cultural extinction the moment its last independent king was captured. Its language persisted in temples and schools. Its religious beliefs, its gods, its myths, its flood story were absorbed almost wholesale into the religious traditions of the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians who followed. Its writing system continued in active use for roughly another 2,000 years after Sumerian ceased to be anyone's native spoken language, gradually adapted to write entirely different languages across an enormous stretch of the ancient Near East. Its law codes directly shaped the more famous Babylonian legal tradition that followed. Its mathematics, its calendar, its astronomy, all of it continued forward, absorbed and built upon by every subsequent civilization that rose in Mesopotamia over the following centuries. Eventually, of course, cuneiform writing itself did die out completely, sometime in the early centuries of the modern era, as we discussed near the very beginning of this video, and Sumerian civilization slipped entirely out of human memory for well over 1,000 years, until 19th century scholars, working from that trilingual cliff inscription in Persia, painstakingly pieced the whole lost world back together. For over a millennium, nobody on Earth knew the Sumerians had ever existed at all, and yet, the entire time, the actual substance of what they built, timekeeping based on 60, written law, formal education, urban government, organized irrigation agriculture, bronze metalworking, remained quietly embedded in the foundations of every civilization that came after them, whether those later civilizations knew the original source or not. What's actually left and what we carry forward. So here we are, back at that dusty, wind-scoured stretch of southern Iraq we started with, standing on ground that used to hold cities of 50,000 people, temples rising higher than anything else for 1,000 miles, and courtrooms where lawyers argued 4,000 years ago over whether a frightened widow deserved the same fate as her husband's murderers. What's physically left today is honestly not very much to look at. Eroded mud brick foundations, the stepped weathered remnant of the great ziggurat of Ur still standing remarkably, though nowhere near its original towering height. Scattered tells, the archaeological term for those low, mounded hills that mark where an ancient settlement once stood, now sitting quietly under the same brutal desert sun that once nourished and eventually poisoned the fields that fed an entire civilization. But physical ruins were never really the point of this video, and if you've stayed with us this long, you already understand exactly why. The actual legacy of Sumer was never primarily architectural. It was conceptual, procedural, and mathematical, and it turned out to be so deeply useful, so thoroughly practical, that it simply never stopped being used, generation after generation, civilization after civilization, right up through the present moment, whether or not anyone doing the using remembered or ever even knew exactly where it originally came from. Think back over everything we've walked through together today. Writing itself, born from clay tokens sealed inside hollow balls, evolving through pictographs into a complete, flexible system capable of recording laws, poetry, love songs, and furious customer complaints, then passed onward through Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian hands for 3,000 years before finally going silent, only to be painstakingly resurrected by 19th century scholars dangling from ropes on a Persian cliff face. The wheel, invented not for chariots or warfare, but for smoothing lopsided clay pots, eventually becoming the foundational mechanical principle behind every rolling, rotating, load-bearing machine humanity has built since. Mathematics built around the number 60 for entirely practical reasons involving fair division of grain and silver, quietly surviving in every clock face and every degree of every circle measured anywhere on Earth today. Irrigation and the plough, transforming an unforgiving floodplain into farmland productive enough to free thousands of people from farming entirely, making room for scribes, priests, soldiers, and merchants, the essential precondition for cities to exist at all. Sailboats, carrying copper and courage across the Persian Gulf, connecting Mesopotamia to Bahrain, to Oman, and quite possibly all the way to the Indus Valley, a trade network vast enough that later kings boasted about it in their own official inscriptions. Written law, born from Ur-Nammu's genuine, deliberate desire to be remembered as a just ruler rather than merely a powerful one, establishing that even a king should be bound by fixed, public, known rules, a principle that travelled directly forward through Hammurabi's far more famous code and onward into essentially every legal tradition that followed across the ancient Near East and beyond. An actual courtroom in Nippur, wrestling honestly with the difficult question of a silent widow's guilt, using careful, nuanced argument that legal scholars today still study for its genuine sophistication. A furious 4,000-year-old customer complaining about bad copper, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that human frustration with poor service is not a modern invention. Formal schools, disciplined to the point of real hardship, producing generation after generation of literate professionals without whom none of the rest of this would have survived on paper at all. A calendar built from careful, patient, nightly observation of the moon, still shaping how nearly every human being on the planet organises their months today. A medical handbook, practical and methodical, treating aching teeth and troubled skin with the same careful documentation the Sumerians applied to grain shipments and legal disputes. Beer, elevated to the status of a goddess, a hymn, and a protected legal category, because the Sumerians understood correctly that a civilization needs more than just survival, it needs genuine shared pleasure too. A board game, inlaid with lapis lazuli, whose rules outlived its original players by over 2,000 years. Bronze, discovered through nothing but patient, dangerous, generational trial and error, giving Sumerian farmers stronger tools and Sumerian armies stronger weapons. And finally, the ziggurat itself, a deliberate mud brick mountain built to house a god, standing at the exact intersection of religion, government, and the accumulated engineering knowledge of everything that came before it. None of these achievements happened in isolation from each other, and that's really the deepest, truest thread running through this entire story. Writing enabled law. Law required scribes, and scribes required schools. Schools required a functioning bureaucracy, and bureaucracy required mathematics. Mathematics enabled astronomy, and astronomy gave the world its calendar. Agriculture and irrigation created the surplus that made cities possible, and cities created the concentrated population density that made writing, law, and formal education genuinely necessary in the first place. Every single invention we've covered today was both a cause and a consequence of every other invention surrounding it, a tightly interlocking system of human ingenuity, each piece supporting and enabling all the others, built up gradually over roughly 2,000 years by people whose individual names, with only a handful of royal exceptions, have been almost entirely lost to us. That last point deserves to sit with you for a moment before we close. We know Ur-Nammu's name because he was a king, and kings had the resources to carve their names permanently into stone and clay. We know Sargon's name for the same reason. We even know Nani's name and Ea Nasir's name, purely by the accident of one furious letter surviving inside a merchant's house for nearly 4,000 years. But we do not know the name of the person who first realized clay tokens could be pressed onto the outside of a sealed ball. We do not know the name of the potter who first tipped their spinning wheel onto its edge and realized it could roll. We do not know the name of the metalworker who first discovered that a specific, careful ratio of tin mixed into copper produced something dramatically stronger than either material alone. These were, almost certainly, ordinary working people, farmers, craftsmen, potters, brewers, and scribes, whose names simply weren't considered important enough for anyone at the time to bother writing down, and who could never have imagined that the small, practical solutions they worked out to solve their own immediate, everyday problems would still be shaping how billions of people around the entire planet organise their time, settle their disputes, and move their goods, roughly 5,000 years later. That's really the quiet, nostalgic heart of this entire story, isn't it? Not kings, not conquest, not even the genuinely staggering scale of what was eventually built, but ordinary people working with mud, reeds, fire, and patient observation, solving small, practical problems one at a time, without any way of knowing they were laying down the first few bricks of absolutely everything that came after them. The next time you glance at a clock, sign a contract, complain about bad customer service, crack open a beer with friends, or simply watch a wheel turn on a car driving past, you're touching something that began in a handful of mud brick towns along two ancient, unpredictable rivers, built by people who never once heard the word Sumer used to describe themselves, and who left behind, almost by accident, the entire operating system of human civilization itself. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.